Rescuing His Heart by Jaclyn Hardy. Chapter 1. Heather checked her phone for the 100th time as her family pulled into the hotel parking lot. Still no cell service. She was supposed to be getting a call at any moment for the job she'd interviewed for, and she was stuck in the middle of southern Idaho for Christmas. Why her parents had chosen to come here for their vacation was beyond her. Yes, her Aunt Cassie lived here, but couldn't they have chosen somewhere warmer? Wow, this is beautiful. So much better than the pictures online. Mom smiled up at what looked more like a mansion than a hotel. Which meant it most likely didn't have Wi-Fi or a pool. A cool breeze blew through the gardens, promising snow. Why they couldn't be at the beach instead was beyond Heather. She should have gone with her roommates. Heather pulled her coat tighter and grabbed her suitcase. Just a couple of days, and she'd be out of here. She could handle that. Leaves blew past them as they went up the walkway, her twin brothers rushing past her. Of course, they'd be excited. They were 10, you look about as excited as I feel. Heather's sister, Janie, smirked. Heather laughed and walked inside. Okay, so this was a little fancier than she'd expected. The decor was more up to date than she'd expected, and they'd obviously updated a lot of it. A large Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with hundreds of lights, bulbs, and ornaments. Large wreaths hung at each window, and Christmas music played quietly in the lobby. Their room was upstairs and to the right. The twins would be with Mom and Dad, so Heather got to share with Janie. The room was small, but it was nice. They'd gone all out with decorating it, and best of all, the bed was comfortable. Heather snuggled under the covers, determined not to get out until it was time to go back home. I'm going exploring. Want to come? Janie pulled on her coat. I think I'll take a nap. You go ahead. And by nap, Heather meant digging into the book she'd been waiting to read. Janie sighed and grabbed Heather's blankets. If I have to be here, so do you. Come on. Maybe there's some cute guys around here somewhere. Great. If you see any of them, say hi. Heather tried to get the blankets back, but it was no use. At 12, Janie was pretty feisty and tended to get what she wanted. Fine. Heather grabbed her jacket. But if they want me to country dance or whatever, I'm ditching you. Janie laughed. It's not like that's all they do all day. Besides, I heard there's a big pre-Christmas dance tonight. How do you hear these things? Heather stopped long enough to grab her wallet in case they decided to go somewhere, then let Janie drag her out of the room. I'm small. People talk all the time when I'm around. Janie didn't let go until they were downstairs. They were talking about it while we checked in. Oh, hey. Look. A large poster was pinned to the bulletin board near the main desk. The dance would have a live band. Most likely country music. But it was better than sitting in her room all night. Fine. We'll go. But if the music is lame, we're leaving early. Someone laughed behind her. Heather turned to find a rather good-looking guy standing there. Too bad there was a ring on his finger, or this trip would have been a lot more interesting. I guarantee you'll like the music. My wife is singing. The man held out a hand. I'm Patrick, by the way. I own this hotel, along with Rachel. Heather could feel her face burning. Sorry about that. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm Heather. Nice to meet you. And you're? Janie. Your hotel is amazing. Patrick smiled. Thanks. Rachel gets most of the credit. I need to get back to work, but I hope you two have fun. Make sure to check out the gardens. He started walking away, but turned around. Oh, and I highly recommend going to the dance tonight. You won't regret it. I'm sure we won't. Heather steered Janie toward the back door so they could go into the gardens. The wind blew hard and cold as they tried to maneuver the paths. Janie stopped and turned back. I think I've had enough air for today. Heather laughed and followed her sister back in. Hot chocolate and a good book in bed sounded like the perfect solution to her. She checked her watch to see what time it was. Perfect. It was still early enough in the afternoon that she could do just that before dinner, and the dance that she hadn't decided if she was going to attend. Want to see what video games they have? Janie pointed toward one of the front rooms of the hotel. No, I'm good, but I bet you can find Eric and Sam there. I'll be up in our room, trying to get warm. Janie took off without looking back. Apparently, she wasn't too heartbroken that Heather hadn't followed. Fair enough. Heather grabbed a packet of hot chocolate from the condiment table and ran upstairs with it. She had a book calling her name. Heather groaned at the knock on the door. She'd just gotten to the best part of the book. They were about to find out who the villain was. She climbed out of her bed and answered the door to find her parents standing there, ready for dinner. Mom glanced down at Heather's pajamas and frowned. You're not going down to dinner in that, are you? Heather must have read longer than she'd thought. Give me a sec. Wait, is Janie in there? She can come down with us. No, she's with Sam and Eric playing games downstairs. Just go. I'll meet you down there. Heather closed the door and stared at the clothes in her luggage. She probably should have unpacked. Oh well. No time now. She grabbed a blouse and a nice pair of pants and changed, then checked to make sure her hair wasn't sticking out all over. The dining room was already full when Heather made it downstairs. Dad waved his arm to let her know where they were sitting. She weaved her way through the tables and sat next to Sam. There are way too many people here to have them all staying at the hotel. Heather opened the menu and glanced through the entrees. Strange. She flagged down a waiter. I was looking for the vegetarian menu. Do you have one? The waiter sighed and left, bringing back a menu a moment later. There you go. Thank you. Heather glanced through the list and ordered eggplant parmesan. Snickering came from the table behind Heather, and she distinctly heard vegetarian among their laughing. She turned to glare at them and met the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. She pushed past her momentary inability to speak. Excuse me? It's not polite to laugh at other people's choices. It is when that person clearly doesn't understand that the hotel is owned by a rancher's daughter. Which means most of the food that comes through this hotel is raised by her family. Insult the food, you insult the family. The man's eyes danced as he spoke, annoying Heather further. I don't care what her farm raises, it gives no one the right to laugh. Heather huffed and turned back around to find her family staring at her. What? Mom leaned forward. Don't speak to people like that. It's rude. Heather wanted to argue back, but this wasn't the place. She stabbed a fork into the side salad in front of her and took a bite before realizing she'd forgotten the dressing. When her dinner came, she looked at it in disgust. She flagged down the waiter. I told you eggplant parmesan. This is lasagna. Please take it back and bring me what I ordered. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back. The waiter took her plate. It's not like meat's going to kill her. Heather bristled and turned in her chair. Seriously. Can you guys keep your opinions to yourselves? More snickers. When she turned back around, her mom glared. What? Ignore them. And stop embarrassing us, please. Mom smiled up at the waiter and shot another look of warning at Heather. Heather poured more dressing onto her salad and ate in silence. It wasn't like this was the first time she'd had people mock her for her choice to go vegetarian. But usually it was from friends teasing her, not complete strangers. Her meal finally came and it was worth waiting for. It was cooked to perfection, something she hadn't expected in a remote place like this. If she could have dishes like this all week, it would be worth the mocking. As soon as the meal was over, employees cleared up the tables and slid them to the sides of the large ballroom. Heather followed her family out of the room while the band set up. She was tempted to go back up to her room to read, but she was curious to know what the dance would be like. Being in med school meant she didn't get out to dance much. Or do anything else, really. Are you staying? Janie looked up at her, hopeful. Mom said I can only stay if you do. I'll stay for a bit. If it's lame, we'll go. Janie grinned. Awesome. I'll go tell Mom. She ran off, leaving Heather a chance to check her messages. She was supposed to find out her grades soon, and she didn't want to miss it. Still nothing. Janie came back breathless. Okay, Mom said you have to keep an eye on me, unless you find a guy. Then you're excused, and I have to go find her. Heather raised an eyebrow. Hey, those were Mom's words, not mine. Figures. Heather stood. Well, good news for you is that I don't plan on that happening tonight. You're stuck with me. Janie rolled her eyes. You make guys sound like a bad thing. And you're 12. You have plenty of dating time ahead of you. Oh, hey, looks like they're letting everyone back in. Heather put her hands on Janie's shoulders so she wouldn't get lost in the crowd. Music echoed off the walls from the live band. They started with a popular country song and everyone cheered. Heather was impressed. Rachel's husband was right. She was good. The crowd cheered and clapped after the first song. Janie bounced on her toes. Heather had never seen anyone who loved dancing more than she did. Go. Dance. I'll watch from here. Janie didn't wait for Heather to say anything else. She ran out into the middle of the line dance going on, and after 1 or 2 sets, she had all of the moves down. She added more of a hip-hop style, but that just made it more fun. Your sister is a great dancer. The man from dinner stood next to her, arms folded. She is. Heather forced herself not to think about how he filled out his button-up shirt quite nicely. He'd been awful to her. But then she hadn't exactly been nice back. A slow song came on, and Janie immediately grabbed a boy close to her age to dance. Heather smiled. Want to dance? Heather looked up at the man in surprise. Saying no would have been rude, and she'd already had her fair share that night. Sure. He leaned closer as the music got louder. Sorry about earlier tonight. I didn't mean to insult your dietary choices. We just don't get a lot of vegetarians around here. Heather smirked. So that's a reason to mock the ones who do choose to eat that way? No. That's not what I meant. He sighed. Can we start over? Hi, I'm Stuart. And you are? Heather. She forced herself to calm down and enjoy the music. Stuart was a good dancer, and she was surprised at how at ease she was with his arms around her. And as long as he was this close, she couldn't get lost in those blue eyes of his. He hummed to the music until he realized what he was doing. Sorry. This is one of my favorites of her songs. You know Rachel? Heather cringed inwardly. Of course he knew her. This town was small, we grew up together. Stuart let go of her waist and spun her before pulling her back in. I hope you enjoy Cottonwood Creek while you're here. If she could spend more time with him, she'd enjoy every minute. Thank you. It was nice to meet you. He smiled, making her knees go weak. Hopefully I'll see you around. I'd ask you to dance again, but I promised my mom I'd let her set me up with at least 2 girls tonight before I take off. I have to be up early in the morning. A flare of jealousy popped up, but Heather waved. Go. Have fun. I'm actually surprised my mom isn't down here doing the same thing. Stuart laughed and pushed his way through the crowd over to a lady who had to be his mom. She pointed over at another woman about Heather's age. Janie chose that moment to tug Heather's hand, pulling her away. She wasn't sure if she should be happy or sad that she couldn't see Stuart from where she stood. They have refreshments. And look. There's like 10 different kinds of cookies and cupcakes. Janie's eyes were wide as she pointed them out. Can I have one? Heather shrugged and took a cupcake for herself. I don't see why not. Janie grabbed 2 cookies. I can't believe you danced with that guy after he was so mean to you. Yeah, well, he asked, and I couldn't say no. And what about you? That boy was pretty cute. Even in the dimness of the room, Heather could see Janie's blush. He was, but he's from here. It's not like we could ever hook up. Again, you're 12. You shouldn't hook up anyway. Heather nodded toward the front of the room. Besides, that doesn't seem to stop him. Looks like he likes you just as much. Janie's blush grew darker. Should I ask him to dance again? Why not? We're on vacation. It's a good time to take chances. Then why don't you ask your guy to dance? Janie shot her a sly smile before pushing her way over to the boy. Heather searched the crowd for Stuart and found him hanging out with the guys who had been sitting at his table. She bit her lip. She'd told Janie to take a chance. Maybe she should, too. No. It was different. Besides, he would have come to ask her to dance already if he'd wanted to. He knew where she was. Wait, where'd he go? Hey, I finally got away from my mom. Would you like to dance again? Stuart stood just inches from Heather, her heart beat rapidly. How did you get over here so quickly? I'm a ninja. But don't tell anyone or you'll ruin my surprise. He took her hand and led her out onto the dance floor. I didn't think ninjas lived in Idaho. He leaned in. That's what we want you to think. Janie met Heather's eye from across the room and gave a thumbs up. Heather couldn't help the burst of laughter that popped out. What? Stuart's cheek brushed hers as he turned to see what she had laughed at. My sister. It's nothing. Heather waited for Stuart to turn back around before she gave a quick thumbs up back to Janie. So, do they do these dances often? Stuart nodded. This mansion used to hold balls all the time, and Rachel wanted to keep them going once she got the hotel opened. It was Patrick's idea to have her perform instead of getting another band. When things are too crazy, she'll hire one out instead. Heather glanced over at Rachel. Stuart seemed to know a lot about her. And the way he said her name told Heather that he must have really liked her at one point. Small towns. Heather shook her head. What now? Nothing. It's just that you seem to know everything about everyone. Well, mostly Rachel and her family, but Heather didn't want to add that part. I know enough. He pulled away once the song ended. I better get going. See you around sometime? Heather wanted that more than she cared to admit. Sure. That would be cool. He grinned again. Perfect. It wasn't until he left the ballroom that she realized he hadn't gotten her phone number. Maybe he'd just said it to be nice. Heather searched the crowd for Janie and then slipped through the crowd to see Janie writing something on the boy's hand. Well, at least it was working for one of them. I'm going to head upstairs. Are you ready to go? Yeah, 1 second. She finished signing with a flourish, then handed the pen back to the boy. Call me after 6 tomorrow. Otherwise, my mom might not like it. Heather raised an eyebrow and left the ballroom with Janie right behind her. The reception area of the hotel was cool and quiet compared to the ballroom. The excitement of the evening faded a little as they walked upstairs. She'd loved dancing with Stuart and part of her wanted to see him again, but it was crazy to even think about. Christmas vacation wasn't exactly the best opportunity to meet the man of her dreams. Chapter 2. Stuart still couldn't believe Heather had danced with him after the jerk he'd been. As soon as she turned around to chew him out, he knew he'd made a mistake. Something about her had made his breath catch, and he knew he needed to see her again. He climbed out of bed and showered quickly so he could get to work. A butcher was busy even on Christmas Eve. People would burn their turkeys or forget to order enough meat to feed the entire extended family. He didn't mind working that day. It was quiet for a lot of the morning, and then he could go home in time for dinner. The shop opened at 8 a.m., and a line had already formed. Stuart opened the door and went behind the counter. Sherry stepped up to the counter. I need a ham. Silly me. I forgot my sister was flying in with her 3 kids. Oh, and can it be one of those fancy honey hams? Stuart picked out a ham and wrapped it up. Here you go. Tell Ellie I said hello. I will, dear. Merry Christmas. She stopped to chat with a few people in the back of the line, then scurried off to her car. Hey, Mrs. Peterson. How was your day? She sighed dramatically. So many family members, not enough food. We have allergies I didn't know about, and then I found out last night my niece is a vegetarian, not that you can help there, so I need another ham and a turkey breast. You don't have any added ingredients, right? The turkey is clean. The ham might have something in it. Stuart packed one of each of them and set them on the scale one at a time. He had to reweigh the turkey 3 times because he was too caught up on the fact that her niece was a vegetarian. It could have been a coincidence. So you don't see your niece often? No, she's off at some fancy college studying to be a surgeon. Can you imagine? Mrs. Peterson took her items off the counter. Wonderful girl. Always such a sweetheart. You should meet her sometime. Stuart rang up the order and took her credit card to run her payment. Maybe so. Have a great day. Merry Christmas. It was almost 10 by the time the last customer left. It was a good thing it was time to close. They were out of hams and had a few turkey breasts left. He packed them up and took them out to his truck. Mom would cook them and take them to a family in the city that needed help. It was a family tradition. The house smelled of cookies, bread, and other goodies when Stuart got home. Laughing came from the living room where most of his family was, but he went straight for the kitchen. Hey, Mom. There are only a few left this year. It's okay. 3 is better than none. She kissed him on the cheek. Could you grab more plates from the cupboard? Then go find your sisters. I told them they'd be helping, but I think they escaped with your cousins. Sounds about right. Stuart found some Christmas paper plates for his mom, then went to find Julia and Natalie. It was fairly easy. He just had to follow the giggles and he'd figure out where they were. When he didn't find them inside, he grabbed his coat and headed out to their old playhouse. They'd outgrown it years before, but it didn't stop them from using it. Hey, Mom needs you two to help with dinner. Julia rolled the dice to the game they were playing. We're almost done. Yes, but Mom isn't. Why aren't you helping? Natalie sat up and put her shoes on. Stuart flicked a game piece, sending the rest of them flying. I'm not helping, because I'm here getting you too. Come on. It wasn't the nicest thing he could have done, but he knew they wouldn't come otherwise. He stepped aside as they ran into the house threatening to tell Mom. Reason number 4000 why he couldn't wait to get his house finished. It was time to leave home as soon as possible. Hopefully he'd have time to work on it between all of the festivities. Mom raised her eyebrows at Stuart when he walked into the kitchen, but he didn't say anything. He'd hear about it later. For now, there was work to be done. Stuart found his dad watching football. Hey, were you able to pick up the lumber yet? It's at the house. Dad helped with Stuart's house when he could get away from the business. This load should take care of the rest of the framing. Sweet. Stuart grinned. His house might just get finished in the next few months. He'd saved up everything he'd earned since graduating from high school to build his own place. A few colleges had begged for him to apply, but his heart was set on starting up his own ranch someday. The doorbell rang, so Stuart went to answer it. Patrick stood in the doorway with a box of pies. Hey, Rachel wanted me to deliver these. You have 2 apple, 2 blueberry, 3 pumpkin, and 1 pecan. Great. We can set them in the garage to keep cold for now. Stuart picked up the box sitting next to Patrick, then walked around the side of the house. They set the boxes on the shelf next to the door. I'll go grab some cash. You can come in if you'd like. Patrick walked in. It smells amazing in here. You're such a sweetheart. Mom handed him some cash and a plate of goodies. Things must be crazy at the hotel this weekend. It's packed. We had to hire a couple more waiters for dinner today. Patrick checked the list in his hand. I'd better get going. This delivery boy's job is never done. Stuart caught Peterson on the list. Hey, want some help? I'm free for a bit. Patrick looked up in surprise. Sure. You can tell me where a few of these people live. I'm still getting used the area, and it's been almost 2 years. I'm convinced Rachel had me do this job so I'd get out from underfoot, because it certainly wasn't for my sense of direction. Be back, Mom. Stuart grabbed his jacket and hat, then met Patrick by his car. Patrick handed Stuart the list. All right, let's start with the closest and move out from there. Okay, first one is 2 blocks away. Take a left at the intersection. Stuart stared at the list. There were 3 others on here, besides the Petersons. He had that long to decide if he was going to try to see Heather or if he would realize how horrible the idea was. So, Mrs. Peterson's niece, huh? Patrick turned the corner. Stuart looked over at him in surprise. What? Patrick grinned. I heard Heather's parents talking, and I saw your eyes light up when you saw which houses I was going to. It wasn't that hard to put together. I'm that transparent, huh? Just to me. I saw you 2 dance last night, and there was definitely a spark there. Stuart laughed. Oh, there's going to be a bigger spark than that pretty soon. Believe me. Did you hear that she's a vegetarian? Ouch. And you didn't tell her you're the town butcher, did you? Nope. Patrick whistled. Not cool, man. But then, I don't think I'd tell her either. Seriously? Okay, I probably would. But hey, maybe she'll leave soon and then you won't have to tell her. Just avoid the topic altogether. Stuart tapped his chin. Now there's an idea. She wouldn't care at all if she found out 10 years down the road, right? Keep dreaming. Patrick pulled up in front of the next house and grabbed a box from the back of the car to take up to the door. He talked to them for a minute, then ran back to the car. The next few stops were fairly close, so both Stuart and Patrick took a box and delivered them to make it go faster. Once they were down to the Petersons, Stuart had almost talked himself out of trying to see Heather. Want this one? Patrick pulled up to the house. I don't think so. Patrick laughed. Look, if you like her, you should at least go say hi. And chances are you might not even see her. What can it hurt? Stuart sighed and got out of the car. He'd have to remember not to hang out with Patrick. The city boy had way too many crazy ideas. Stuart took the box of pie up to the house and adjusted the box so he could get to the doorbell. Several footsteps pounded toward the door before it finally opened. Heather stood there with her sleeves pulled up and an apron over her dress. Stuart forgot how to speak for a minute, but at least Heather had the same problem. Who is it, dear? Mrs. Peterson pushed past her. Oh, Stuart, sweetie. Did I forget something? No, I'm helping deliver the pie. Patrick was doing delivery and doesn't have everyone's addresses down yet. He apparently couldn't talk to Heather, but he could spew all kinds of nonsense to Mrs. Peterson instead. Want me to take them in for you? She moved out of the way of the door. Thank you, dear. Would you just set them on the counter? We can take them from there. Stuart smiled at Heather as he walked past and into the kitchen. Several people stood around the living room, staring at him. He waved and hurried back to the doorway where Heather still stood. Merry Christmas. He smiled and went past her. Thanks for the pie, Heather called out. Stuart turned and managed to trip on a planter. His face burned as he waved. You're welcome. See you around. He limped back to the car and found Patrick laughing. Was that as bad as I think it was? Probably worse. Patrick laughed again and pulled out onto the road. So many stories to tell the grandkids someday. Grandkids? I doubt it. I'm sure she's inside right now laughing hysterically. Patrick turned the corner to head back to Stuart's. Most likely, but at least you made an impression. Kinda like that planter made an impression in my ankle. They pulled up to Stuart's house. Thanks again for helping out. Have a great Christmas. Oh, hey. We're going ice fishing next weekend with Rachel's dad and a few of the ranch hands if you want to tag along. I'll have to see what our schedule looks like, but it should be fine. Stuart waved and ran into the house. Mom and the girls had left while Stuart was gone, so the house was much quieter than it had been earlier. Dad and a few of his cousins were back in the living room watching football. Stuart was tempted to flop on the couch and watch with them, but it wasn't often he had a break. "I'm heading over to the house, Dad." Dad looked up from the game. "Okay, this game is almost done. I'll be there as soon as it's over." "Sounds good." Stuart grabbed his keys off the counter and headed out to his truck. The bite to the air meant they might actually have a white Christmas, but it also meant he needed to get the rest of the framing done before it hit. Stuart's house was out away from the city, and the drive gave him a chance to think. He may have imagined it, but it seemed that Heather was happy to see him. But would she be that happy if she knew what he did for a living? Probably not. The house stood there waiting for him when he pulled up. The lumber that had been delivered sat on the floor inside the house. Stuart climbed out of his truck and walked over to the generator to turn it on. The familiar rumble started up, and he was soon busy measuring and cutting lumber to build the last few walls. He'd just finished a wall and was ready to stand it up when his dad and several other trucks pulled up in the yard. The weather was bitter cold by that time, but it didn't stop them from pulling on gloves and grabbing tools. "Thought you could use some more help." Dad grinned. Stuart nodded. "The more we can get done the better. If some of you could start on the plywood around the outside, I can finish up here. Then we can add the plastic before the storm hits." It was going to be next to impossible with the amount of sunlight they had left, but he wouldn't tell them that. While Dad told everyone what their jobs would be, Stuart finished the wall he'd been working on and moved to the next. "We're just about out of lumber." Dad rested his arms on the half wall between the kitchen and living room. "Good thing this is the last wall then." Stuart secured another 2x4 to the wall and moved on to the next one. Dad turned in a circle. "This is going to be a huge house for one man." Stuart laughed. "I don't plan to have just me in here forever. Besides, I'll need ranch hands and a cook. And a wife." Dad's hint was one he'd given a million times. "Yes, that too. At some point." He added the next board. "Can you grab me some more nails?" Dad chuckled and grabbed a box. "I hear you spent some time with a girl last night." The joys of small towns. A person couldn't sneeze without someone else knowing about it. "Yeah, I did. I guess. It was 2 dances. I danced with several other women as well. But only one caught your attention." The statement was loaded, and they both knew it. Stuart hadn't really talked to any women outside of work after Rachel was married. Or before, really. He'd had his heart set on her since high school. It was too bad. She'd always thought of him as a good friend. He stood and stretched. "Her name is Heather. She's feisty, funny, and would not approve of my occupation if she knew what it was." "I'd heard that part, too. Maybe you should just tell her." Dad took one end of the wall and Stuart took the other. They lifted it and Stuart attached it to the floor before answering. "If what you did for a living was completely against what Mom believed in, would you tell her?" "Sure. But that's me." Dad put a hand on his shoulder. "Look, do you like this girl? I barely know her. And I've already upset her at least twice." Dad raised his eyebrows. "Was that before or after she danced with you?" "Before." Stuart set down the nail gun and stretched. "So, let me get this straight. You upset her, and then dance not 1, but 2 dances with her?" Dad shook his head. "Son, if someone is willing to get past your dumb mistakes, that's not someone you should let go. Speaking of which, we'd better get back home. Your mom isn't going to like it if we're late." Stuart turned off the generator and gathered his supplies. He'd come back and finish with the rest of the lumber after Christmas lunch. Everyone else had left by the time Stuart climbed into his truck. A light snow fell as he made his way back into town. Perfect for a white Christmas. Several cars were parked outside their house when he pulled in. Most had been at his new home just half an hour before, but it looked like his grandparents had made it down from Boise as well. Noise welcomed him inside as everyone piled into the living room for the annual talent show that the grandkids put on. Stuart grabbed some of the dinner left on the table, then took his place in the back as his two nieces stood in the front. Their tap dance routine was adorable as usual. The show ended, and after the reading of the Nativity, Mom slipped into the kitchen to get their eggnog milkshake started. Stuart joined her and took cups out of the cupboard. How much were you able to get done? Mom scooped ice cream into a bucket that sat in the sink. Framing is done. The guys got the plywood on except for the roof, so that's next. Stuart handed her a carton of eggnog. Mom poured it in. That's great. I'll have to go by tomorrow to see what it all looks like. She turned on the beater to mix the shakes while Stuart gathered spoons. Others gathered in the kitchen, eagerly awaiting their treats. This was the last tradition of the night before everyone headed off to bed. Stuart made sure everyone else had theirs before handing one to his mom and taking one for himself. They leaned against the sink counter. Mom rested her head against Stuart's shoulder and sighed. I don't know what I'm going to do when you're not around to help out. I'm not that far away. Besides, Natalie or Julia can step in. It's not the same and you know it. Stuart kissed his mom's forehead. I know. Christmas morning had already come and gone, and Stuart looked forward to a long nap. His house called him to work on it, but he hadn't slept much the night before. Too many thoughts of Heather ran through his mind. It was ridiculous. They'd met twice, and one of those times he'd insulted her. But something about her had his mind all confused. Stuart busied himself helping Mom with lunch. The quicker it was done, the sooner he could go upstairs and sleep. He took the turkey juices and poured them into a pot on the stove to start the gravy, his favorite part of the meal. Don't forget we need some of that for the stuffing. Mom took a large stock pot and filled it with dried bread. You have plenty left in the roaster. Stuart turned the heat down and added cornstarch to thicken it. Is everyone here? Yes. And we should be ready by about 1 o'clock. Mom took a spoon of gravy to taste. Perfect. Good job. Stuart turned the stove down. I'll go find Dad so he can carve the turkey. Dad and his brother sat in the living room watching football. As soon as he saw Stuart, Dad stood. I suppose it's my turn now? Yep. Stuart stepped out of the way so his dad could pass, then went back to finish the gravy. When it was done, he took it into the dining room. The table was packed with potatoes, turkey, salads, vegetables, stuffing, and rolls. A few people sat there talking, while others were in the kitchen talking and washing their hands. Mom knocked a spoon up against a pan to get everyone's attention. Now that we're all here, let's take our seats so we can bless the food. Stuart sat down in the middle of the table between his grandma and his younger cousin. His dad said the blessing, then everyone took a little of whatever dish was in front of them and passed it to the next person. They'd had Christmas dinner together often enough that everyone knew the routine. At least here everything remained unchanged and he didn't have to make a fool out of himself. Chapter 3. Heather yawned and rested her head on the couch. She'd tried to help with lunch, but her Aunt Cassie wouldn't hear of it. It was a good thing she'd slipped her book into her purse the night before. The roads had been bad enough when they'd planned to leave the night before that they stayed at their aunt's house. Heather put her slippers on that Janie had given her and opened her book to read. Hey, sweetie, have you seen the boys? Mom stood over the couch. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were reading. It's fine. And no, I haven't, but I can almost guarantee they're out in the snow. Mom sighed. I was hoping that wouldn't be the case, but who can blame them? Several inches had fallen over the night. She'd heard several times that this was the most they'd seen in years. All Heather knew was that her warm clothes and blanket were waiting at the hotel, and she was anxious to get back to them. Heather, come on. You have to see the snowman I built. Janie grabbed Heather's wrist and pulled. It was no use. Heather laughed and set her book aside. There were too many things going on for her to actually be able to read. Your hands are freezing. Did you wear gloves? No, but I used some of Amy's socks. Heather followed Janie to the window and looked out at the activity in the backyard. The ground was almost bare in places because it had been used to build forts and snowmen. Her cousins had red faces, and steam came from their mouths with every breath, but they looked like they were having the time of their lives. Come out with us. Janie stood next to Heather. Tell you what. Let's wait until after dinner is done, and then if the roads clear up, we can go sledding. Janie's eyes brightened. Really? Sure. There's the mountain right behind the hotel. There's got to be a good hill around there somewhere, right? I'll go ask. Janie squealed and hugged Heather before running off to put her boots on. She was most likely headed off to tell her brothers about going sledding. Aunt Cassie stood at the counter, cutting up some vegetables for a veggie tray. Hey, do you know of any good hills to sled on around here? Heather took the carrots from the pile and began chopping those. We have them all over around here. It just depends on how far up into the mountains you want to drive. Heather grabbed another carrot to chop. My warm stuff is at the hotel, so it would have to be somewhere over there. Oh, right. Well, the Poltons have that trail they take horses up every day. They're bound to know of a good place. I'd ask them. Aunt Cassie took the knife from Heather. Now, run along. Dinner is almost done. She'd tried. Heather wandered off to find something else to do. The doorbell rang, and since she was the closest, she went to answer it. A young couple about her age stood at the door holding a tray of cookies. Oh, hey. These are for Mrs. Peterson. Could you give them to her? Of course. Heather took them. Merry Christmas. The girl smiled. Thank you. Are you her daughter? She told me she had a few. No, her niece. I'm Heather. She held a hand out for them to shake. Nice to meet you. I'm Laura. This is Justin. She stood there for a moment before clearing her throat. Anyway, we just wanted to drop those off. Heather waved as they turned and left. It wasn't until after she'd shut the door that she realized she probably should have invited them in. She took the cookies into the kitchen. Laura and Justin brought these by for you. Oh, those dears. They shouldn't have. She wiped her hands and took the plate. Oh, she knew just what I wanted. Her chocolate chip cookies are divine. Heather took one off the plate when her aunt offered. She took a bite and the cookie almost melted in her mouth. Wow, these really are good. Aunt Cassie passed them to the rest of the group. Oh, your mom is looking for you. Something about finding tubes for your sledding trip. She's out back. Thank you. Heather pulled off her slippers and went to find her boots. At least she'd thought of wearing those. Mom stood out at an old shed going through shelves. Oh, there you are. Come and help me find the tubes. So you're okay with us going sledding? Are you kidding? You're leaving the house and doing something with your siblings. I couldn't be more thrilled. Mom yanked on a dusty tube, and several others fell down with it. Oops. Heather bent down to help inspect them for holes. I'm just trying to get some relaxing done before my last semester. I want to be as ready as I can be for when I get my residency. So which locations did you request? Mom had hoped Heather would go somewhere close to them in Wyoming, but what was the point in a residency close to home? I just wrote in a few names that came to mind. Heather set the tubes aside that looked promising and set the rest on the shelf. Just as long as you don't end up across the country from us. Mom grabbed a pump and they took that and the tubes to their car. Heather was personally hoping for Southern California, but she figured she'd keep that to herself. 3 more months and she'd know where she'd be going. It couldn't come fast enough. Heather trudged up the hill, dragging a tube behind her. This would be about the 10th time, and her legs were screaming at her. But she had to admit that this was the first time in a long time that she'd allowed herself to actually relax and have fun. Reading her book in her room wasn't quite the same. She waited for Eric to move before sitting in her tube. Janie scrambled up the last few feet. Wait. Let's race. Only if you're ready to lose. Sure. I'm smaller than you. I'll fly. Janie climbed onto her tube. Ready? Go. Heather laughed and pushed off. Trust Janie to take off before she said go. The wind was cold as she flew down the slope. Every bump jarred her, but it only made her laugh harder. By the time she came to rest at the bottom of the hill, Heather was frozen, but she felt refreshed. She'd have to go sledding again the next day if they had time. You lost. You owe me your dessert. Janie stood above her with a hand on her hip. That wasn't the agreement. Heather rolled off her tube and stood. Her legs were jelly from climbing so many times. I'm going to head back to the car. You guys can go a few more times if you'd like. Janie turned and ran. Okay. The wind whipped her words away as it grew colder and stronger. Heather climbed in the car and turned it on to get the heat flowing. She should have told Janie to only go one more time. It was only a couple of miles back to the hotel, but the snow was beginning to drift. When another 15 minutes passed, Heather decided it was time to go. The sky had darkened with snow clouds, and the wind was getting worse. She tried to open the door, but a drift had blown up against their car. Great laughter sounded just outside the door on the other side of the car, and the doors opened. Janie threw her tube in the back of the car. You should have seen it. Eric and Sam totally collided at the bottom of the hill. Did they get hurt? Heather turned in her seat to check them as they climbed in. They both had goose eggs on their foreheads, but otherwise they looked fine. Did you get everything? Gloves, scarves? Yes, Mom. Janie rolled her eyes. Let's go. I'm dying for some hot chocolate. Heather turned back around and pulled on her seat belt. Buckle up. The roads aren't going to be very fun. That was an understatement. It was a whiteout from the blowing snow. She had to focus just in front of her so she could tell where the road was. If she tried to accelerate at all, the tires slid. Heather held her breath as she slowed to turn the corner. The car turned and slid, but she turned the steering wheel into the skid and managed to gain control. Whoa. Sam's voice came from the back of the car. Do that again, Eric said, laughing. I'd rather not. Hold on and pray we get there. Heather continued on, careful not to touch the gas pedal. This road wasn't quite as bad because of the direction of the wind, but it was still slick. Heather sped up a little, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Almost there. They turned the corner and stopped suddenly. Heather had hit something. She put the car in park and climbed out. A drift had blown across the road and she was stuck. How had she not seen it? Heather got back in the car and found her phone. Hey, Dad? We're stuck. How far out? Heather glanced around, but all she could see was white. I don't know. Pretty sure we're just down the road. I don't even know how I hit a drift. I didn't see anything. The wind is bad enough, everything blends together. I'll see if I can find someone to help. Keep the heater on and grab the blankets from the back. Okay. Heather hung up and turned to Janie. Grab the blankets. Dad's going to get some help. Janie nodded and reached for them. They're wet from the tubes. They're better than nothing. I'm going to see if I can dig us out. Heather climbed back out before anyone could say anything and looked for something to use. All she could find was a huge branch. That would have to do. Her fingers stung as she worked, but she needed to get out of there before the weather got worse. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend Christmas. The beach sounded better all the time. A truck pulled up and Heather leaned against her car, thankful for a short break. Her heart thumped hard in her chest from exertion, but it almost stopped when Stuart climbed out of the truck. He pulled his coat close to him and leaned into the wind as he walked over to her. Need some help? No, I like being stuck in the middle of a blizzard. Heather cringed. Why did her smart mouth have to show up at the worst times? I didn't see the drift. They do that. Stuart went back to his truck and grabbed some rope. Climb inside so you can steer. We'll have you out of there in no time. Heather nodded, not trusting herself to say something somewhat decent. After he'd secured the rope to the hitch of her car, he walked back to his truck and Heather climbed in her car. It took several tries before the car finally budged. Stuart stopped and came back to untie the rope. "Thanks for your help." Heather shivered in the icy wind. "No problem. I'll follow you back to the hotel, to make sure no more drifts jump out at you." Heather opened her mouth to snap back, but she forced it closed. She put her car in reverse and drove around the offending drift, before continuing on. "Was that the guy from the dance the other night?" Janie asked. "Yeah." "Wow. It's a good thing he came and found us." Heather pursed her lips, but kept quiet. She would have preferred waiting for her dad. The road had gotten worse, and by the time they got back to the hotel, Heather had decided she never wanted to drive in the snow again. She was surprised to see Stuart pull in behind her. Surely he could have just gone home after helping her. She left the tubes in the car, but made sure to grab the blankets, scarves, and gloves her brothers and sister had left. She turned and almost ran into Stuart. "Sorry, I just wanted to see if you needed help." "Your hands are full." "I've got it." Heather used her hip to slam the car door shut. "Thanks again for pulling us out. Are the roads always like this in the winter?" Stuart shrugged. "Sometimes. It's not the snow that's the problem. It's the wind that makes things so bad out there." "I noticed." They hurried into the hotel and Heather took all of their coats up to her parents' room. She was surprised when they didn't answer their door. They must have already gone down to dinner. She set everything in her room instead and went back downstairs to find her family. The dining room was full of people. Heather found her mom and siblings at one of the tables, so she made her way over to them, then stopped short when she realized that Stuart was sitting there with them. "Hey." She sat down and picked up her menu. "Where's Dad?" "He's going to let Patrick and the others know that you made it here, thanks to Stuart." Mom beamed. Stuart chuckled. "I'm glad I could help. I thought you would have headed home by now." "I'm not going anywhere on these roads tonight. It's not safe." Stuart set his menu down. "Besides, I didn't want to miss Rachel's fried chicken. It's the best around." "Do a lot of people eat out here?" "I'd think it's a ways out just to go to dinner." Stuart raised his eyebrows. "I don't know if you've noticed, but nothing is close by. We have to go into Twin to do most of our shopping, so a lot of people will come here for lunch. I'm only around because I just finished working on my house and knew I wouldn't get into town in this storm." Heather raised her eyebrows. "Your house?" "Yeah, I'm building a house just up the road from here. The framing is done, and we were able to get plastic over it so it would be protected from the snow. I just hope it works." Stuart smiled up at the waitress. "Hey, Laura. Could I get some chicken, mashed potatoes, and broccoli?" "Perfect." The waitress, Laura, turned to Heather. "I'll have the chef's salad and steamed veggies." Heather handed her the menu. Laura wrote down the order. "Anything to drink?" Heather shook her head. "I'll have water." "Perfect. I thought you were doing the marketing side of working here." Stuart smiled up at Laura. Laura smiled. "I am, but Rachel asked me to work tonight. The storm is preventing some of her other employees from getting here." Heather shook her head. It was amazing how well everyone knew each other here. But then she'd only been here for a couple of days and had run into Laura at her aunt's house and kept meeting up with Stuart. Getting to know everyone well seemed to be pretty easy here. "So, Stuart, tell us about yourself." Heather's mom smiled. "All I know is that you're building a house and you saved my kids from the storm." Stuart paled and looked down at his table. Great. He was probably some kind of criminal and Heather had spent all this time with him. Go figured. He finally cleared his throat. "Well, I grew up here. Graduated a few years ago, and now I'm building a house so I can start my own ranch." Heather's dad is a builder. He's built half the houses in our city. Here she goes again. Heather pushed down the urge to roll her eyes. Not that it wasn't true. Dad had snagged a major account a few years back and Heather was thrilled for him, but Mom loved to brag about it. Stuart seemed to relax a little. That's awesome. This has been slow going because of work and the weather, but I'm hoping to have it done by spring. Well, I'm sure glad you were working on it today so you could be around to help pull Heather out. Mom brightened and waved. Here's her dad now. Dad set a hand on Heather's shoulder as he moved around her. Hey, sweetie. Is this the guy who saved the day? Sure. Dad, this is Stuart. Heather wanted to hide her face as he looked between her and Stuart. He remembered faces better than anyone, which meant he probably remembered the fact that Stuart was the one she'd yelled at just a few days before. Nice to meet you. Dad sat next to Mom and picked up his menu. How was sledding? Awesome. Eric leaned forward and had to talk over the top of his brother and Janie as they told stories of what had happened on the hill. Heather turned to Stuart and kept her voice low. Is everything okay? Yeah, why? Stuart wouldn't meet her eyes because as soon as my mom asked about you, I saw a look of panic. Should I be worried? Did you rob a bank or something? Stuart burst out laughing. No, nothing like that. I just don't like to talk about myself. I'm just a small-town guy who chose not to go to college. Heather tipped her head to the side. Why would that be bad? Do you really think I'm that big of a snob? No. Nothing like that. Stuart paused. It's just, is that true, Stuart? Dad interrupted Stuart. You're building your own house? Again, Stuart breathed a sigh of relief as he turned his attention to Heather's dad. Yes, it is. So, what style are you going with? One story? Two? Stuart glanced at Heather before answering. It's 2 stories. Ranch style. Getting any more out of Stuart was going to be impossible now that Dad had him talking houses. Heather was grateful for the salad that was set in front of her because it gave her something else to concentrate on. Stuart was hiding something, and she was determined to figure out what it was. Chapter 4. Stuart could have hugged Heather's dad for showing up when he did, which he wouldn't because that would just be weird. The fact that he was a butcher was going to come out a lot sooner than he'd hoped, and there wasn't much he could do about it. Stuart knew that the interruptions that kept popping up would only work for so long. The storm hadn't improved at all in the time they'd had dinner. Stuart was stuck for the night. He sighed and turned from the window to go check on a room reservation. Heather still sat at a table with her family. But then most of the dinner crowd hadn't moved either. There wasn't much else to do while they were stuck here. He wove his way through the tables and out of the front desk. Hey, Rachel. It's quite a crowd here, tonight. She smiled. Isn't it great? I'd worried that this place would be empty for Christmas with everyone traveling out of town. Well, now they have a fancy place to stay. Why go anywhere else? Stuart cleared his throat. He still hadn't gotten over the crush he'd had on her since first grade. Speaking of which, I don't suppose there's a spot for me anywhere here? Her smile turned to a frown. I'm sorry, but we're totally booked. But hold on. Let me see what I can do. Even a corner and a blanket would work for the night. Rachel shook her head. We're not that desperate yet. We have a couch or two. Stuart chuckled. That sounds much better. I'll get you some blankets. While you're waiting, do you think you could find Patrick? I figure while everyone is here, we might as well play a little music. I can do that. He left the front desk and wandered toward the kitchen. Several cooks sat at a table eating their dinner, while a few others still stood at the stoves. Hey, has anyone seen Patrick? Pretty sure he's down in the cellar, checking on the furnace, one chef said. Lance? Something like that, thanks. Stuart turned and headed for the cellar. He'd come to the mansion a few times as a teenager, and he still couldn't believe the changes that had been made in this place. They'd cemented the walls and floor to prevent flooding and mold and added electricity. Patrick crouched next to the furnace, muttering to himself. That bad, huh? We have a full hotel, and the pilot decides to go out. Patrick glanced back at him. What are you doing out in this storm? Stuart crouched down next to him. Saving damsels in distress. Patrick laughed and turned a knob. Sounds exciting. Who's the lucky girl? I'll give you one guess. Stuart picked up the lighter that lay on the floor. He'd had to fix the pilot light for his mom a few times, no way. Yup. Stuart pushed the reset button and held it while Patrick lit the pilot. A few clicks and a whoosh. Perfect. There you go. If Rachel asks, I was the one who fixed this. Patrick shut the door to the furnace and stood. Stuart wiped his hands on his jeans. Got it. Patrick grabbed a couple of cans of hot chocolate and handed them to Stuart before grabbing 2 more. So, how'd you manage to run into her this time? Snowstorm. I decided driving home would be a bad idea, so I headed this way. She'd managed to get herself stuck in a drift, so I pulled her out. And I don't suppose you told her what you do for a living yet? Patrick turned the lights off to the cellar and walked up the stairs. Stuart snorted. No. We always seem to be around her family, and I don't want them all hating me. Are they all vegetarians? Patrick asked, surprised. No, just her. So what's the problem? Stuart set the cans on the shelf next to Patrick's. I took too long. Now I'll just look like a complete liar for not saying anything sooner. Patrick shrugged. I figure if she's as amazing as you think she is, she'll figure out how to deal with it. I doubt it. Stuart heard Rachel laugh in the lobby. Oh, man. I forgot why I came to find you. Rachel wants to put on a small concert. She needs help getting everything set up. I was about to go suggest the same thing. Patrick left the kitchen and found Rachel in the lobby. Your errand boy just remembered what he was supposed to tell me. Did you get everything moved? Stuart laughed. I may have forgotten, but I did save your hotel by restarting the pilot light. Fair enough. Would you two stop? Rachel laughed. Everyone heard concert and had everything moved within minutes. We just need to get the equipment set up. That's my cue. Patrick waved to Stuart and headed for the ballroom. The couch called Stuart. It was the first time in a long time he wouldn't need to wake up early for work, and he looked forward to a good night's rest. But he knew that as soon as the music started up, he wouldn't be able to sleep. He went to the ballroom to see if there was anything he could help with, but Rachel had been right. Everything was pretty much ready to go. Some of the crowd had pulled their chairs close to the stage so they could watch her perform, but there was still plenty of space for dancing, nothing like an impromptu concert for Christmas. Heather's voice pulled Stuart's attention away from the stage. I don't think Rachel wants us to be bored while we're stuck here. Stuart replied. Heather glanced between Stuart and the stage. So, what's the history with you two? We've been friends since grade school. And how long did you have a crush on her? Heather's eyes danced as she waited for an answer. Stuart looked at her in surprise. It was that obvious? Probably. Since high school. But Patrick is perfect for her. I can almost forgive him for snatching her away. But she kinda had that effect on everyone around her. I can name several others in this town who felt the same way. Heather smiled. She seems really nice. And her voice is beautiful. Christmas music started up and Rachel sang White Christmas. Some danced while others sat there listening to Rachel's mesmerizing voice. Stuart glanced over at Heather. She was caught by the spell as well, it seemed. He leaned close to her ear. Want to dance? Heather blinked and looked over. I don't even know how to dance to this song. Stuart stood and held out a hand for her. She took it, sending a shiver through him. He led her out to the dance floor and wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. The thing about Christmas songs is that you can dance however you want. So you chose the waltz? Heather raised an eyebrow. Why not? He let go and twirled her in a circle before bringing her back in. See? Perfect. Heather blushed. You dance pretty well for a small-town guy. Stuart held his heart. You insult me. I'll have you know, I learned from the best. Oh? You took dance? If you call learning to waltz in my grandma's living room taking dance, then yes. She insisted on teaching all of us. Memories of summer nights at her house flooded his mind. She studied dance at Juilliard and traveled the world before marrying my grandpa and settling here. Wow. That's amazing. Heather pulled away as the song ended. Did she ever regret leaving the stage? Stuart shrugged. Probably. But she never admitted it. She always said marrying a farmer and raising a family was her next big adventure. Heather shook her head. You're just this huge ball of surprises. You know that, right? She had no idea. Only if she found out that one big thing, she wouldn't think it was so cool. Pretty much. Now, would you like to rock around the Christmas tree with me? The concert went on for another 2 hours, before people started drifting off to their rooms. Stuart jumped in and picked up the other end of a table to help Patrick. He was staying here for free tonight, so he needed to pay it off somehow. Great concert as usual. Stuart set his end down and went to get the next table. I'll never get tired of hearing her sing, Patrick said. They moved the table into place and then went for the chairs. Within minutes, everything was done, and the hotel employees left as quickly as they'd come. So much for paying for a place to stay. He wiped his forehead and picked his jacket up off the floor. The lobby had emptied out as well, which was a good thing, since he'd be sleeping there that night. Rachel came out of the kitchen. Oh, hey, there you are. I was just coming to find you. I wondered if you wanted us to set up a cot in one of the conference rooms instead. It'll be loud in the morning and I want you to be able to sleep. Stuart hesitated. Are you sure? Of course. There won't be any meetings here in the morning. Besides, you'll be warmer in the smaller room. Good point. If it's not too much trouble, I'd prefer that. It's been a while since I've been able to sleep in, and I'm looking forward to it. Rachel handed him a key. Perfect. Take the first one on the left. There's more space in that one. Thanks. Stuart grabbed his blankets and pillow and went to find the room she was talking about. The conference table in this room took up quite a bit of space, but he didn't mind. He used 2 blankets below him and one for on top. Once that was set up, he checked the vents to make sure they were open. Now all he needed was a toothbrush and he'd be set. The lights in the lobby had been turned down low, but Rachel still sat at the desk, staring at the computer. Stuart cleared his throat. Do you have a spare toothbrush? If not, I'm sure I can survive. Yes, we do. There. She looked through the shelves under the desk. I bet we have more upstairs in the hall closet. I'll go get them. No, it's fine. I can grab them. Closet at the end of the hall? Rachel handed him another key. Thank you. Think you could grab me a handful? Of course. Stuart took the stairs 2 at a time and walked past all of the rooms. The key to this lock was an old-fashioned brass key. Rachel must have kept the original locks up here. He'd been out here a few times over the years, and he'd always been amazed by the architecture. He'd modeled some of his own blueprints after this hotel. He grabbed a handful of toothbrushes and a toothpaste, then grabbed another couple of blankets so he wouldn't freeze. He had to juggle everything to close the closet door and lock it, but he finally got it done. He turned to head back downstairs and came face to face with Heather. Oh, hey. I figured you were asleep by now. She lifted her own toothbrush. Apparently we were both thinking the same thing. I guess so. Stuart showed her his handful. Except I have a few more than you do. Heather laughed. Brushing once isn't enough for you? Nope. I'm very serious about dental hygiene. Stuart grinned. Need some help? She pointed at the blankets. Stuart thought of saying no, but he couldn't pass up the chance to spend more time with her. Sure. But don't you need to brush your teeth? Nope, just got done. Let me drop this off in my room and then I'll grab those. She hurried down the hall and came back a moment later. So do you always stockpile hotel supplies? I asked Rachel for a toothbrush and she asked me to get others. The blankets are for me, though. I figure I might as well save them up for my house. Heather raised an eyebrow. I see. Stuart stopped at the front desk and set the supplies down. I grabbed more blankets. I hope that's okay. Rachel nodded. I'm already feeling guilty you're sleeping on the floor. Take whatever you need. Thanks. Stuart continued to the conference room and set his blankets on the makeshift bed. You can just set them there. I'll lay them out. Heather turned away and walked over to a bookshelf full of games. This is an interesting addition to a conference room. I guess they figure even big city executives need to play games sometimes too. He pulled out a card game. Want to play? Sure, it's okay. I mean, we wouldn't want to mess with cards for big city executives. Heather continued down the row of games. They have quite a collection here. This must be another game room or something. Or they want these games out of the hands of the younger kids. Stuart picked up another deck of cards. Ever played Nerds? Heather raised an eyebrow. Nerds? That's what my family calls it at least. It's like a competitive version of solitaire. He handed one of the decks to Heather. Okay. Stuart sat at the end of the table and pointed to the chair to the side of him. Okay, set it up like solitaire and I'll set up mine. Once they were both done, Stuart held up a card. Have you played Speed? Yep. Awesome. This is a mix of the two games. You can play on my piles or yours. The goal is to be the first one done with all of your cards. Got it? Heather nodded, her face the model of fierce determination. Let's do this. Go. The flipping of cards and slapping them down on the table were the only sounds in the room until Stuart set his last card down. Done. No. Heather kept going until she was done. Let's do it again. Stuart chuckled. I think I just created a monster. You have no idea. Heather gathered all the cards and separated them out. Best 2 out of 3? Sure. Stuart checked the clock. It was just past midnight. Normally he'd have been in bed a few hours ago. He should have felt guilty leaving his dad to work at the butcher shop in the morning, but he was here sitting with a beautiful woman, playing a card game his grandpa had taught him years before. And if he could have stopped time, he would have stayed right there. Heather held up a card. Ready? Yep. Go. Stuart flew through his cards, but Heather was the one to slap her last card down first. I did it. Heather danced in her chair before stopping suddenly. She cleared her throat. Sorry. Our family might have a slight competitive streak. Stuart took the cards. Unfortunately for you, so does mine. We're tied. Now it's time for you to go down. Heather's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. Go. Stuart set cards down as quickly as he could. The numbers went up and down and piles filled up. He set down the last card and cheered at the same time Heather did. No, I won. See? I put down the 9. Nope, sorry. I'd already put mine down right here. Heather pointed at another pile. I won. Stuart shook his head. You still had another card. No, that went there. Heather leaned forward. I won. That's it. We have to have a tiebreaker. Heather raised an eyebrow. I beat you fair and square. I won 2 out of 3. I'm not so sure about that. See, I put my card down at the same time. Stuart pointed at his card. Unless you're afraid you'll lose. Heather's eyes lit up as she grinned. Never. Another round? Stuart gathered up the cards to separate them again. Okay, but then we should probably get some sleep. I'm not used to being up this late. Really? Heather asked, surprised. It's what, midnight? Not the way he'd wanted to bring up work. Hey, I like my beauty sleep. It takes a lot to look this good. Ah, so that's your secret. Heather took her cards from him. I'll have to remember that while I'm trying to study for my exams. You don't need it. You're already beautiful enough as it is. Stuart looked up from shuffling his cards and caught her blush. Sorry. That was cheesy. Heather held up a card. Cheesy, but sweet. Ready? Prepare to go down. Stuart slapped down his card and the last game started. His shuffling hadn't done good things for his deck. He still had 3 left when Heather put hers down. Wow. And that's what happens when you challenge me. She stood and stretched. Thanks for the fun night. I needed something like this. Stuart scooted his chair back and moved over to the office door. You're welcome. I did too. Heather was just inches from him. If he tipped her chin up. Instead, he brushed a strand of hair from her face. She sucked in a breath, her eyes wide. Stuart hesitated long enough for her to step back, disappointment etched in her face. See you around. Hey, wait. Stuart caught up to her. Want to hang out tomorrow? Heather brightened. Sure. What did you have in mind? Well, depending on what the weather does, we could go to the diner in town. But if the snow is bad enough, we could hang out here. There's a pond between here and Rachel's ranch that we could ice skate on. I guess I have to pray that it keeps snowing tonight. She went up on her toes and kissed Stuart on the cheek. See you tomorrow. Stuart stood in the center of the dark lobby as Heather ran up the steps to her room. The feel of her soft lips on his cheek sent a rush of emotions through him, and he knew that the next time he had the chance to kiss her, he wouldn't hesitate for a moment. Chapter 5. Heather knew if she climbed out of bed, she'd freeze, and she wasn't quite ready to do that yet. Janie had already gone down to breakfast, leaving the room empty. The wind beat against the window, making Heather smile. Hopefully that meant Stuart was still around. Even that didn't get her out of bed. If she went downstairs, the memories from last night might prove to be wrong. She couldn't believe she'd kissed him. It was on the cheek, but still, it was so completely out of character for her. But then, so was sitting up half the night playing card games with a guy. Why did she think getting into a relationship right now was a good idea? Not that it was going to happen. Stuart was a nice guy who she enjoyed hanging out with, who made her stomach flutter every time he smiled at her with those dimples. But it didn't matter. She only had a few more days before it was time to go back to school. And with that came the letter that would determine her future, which meant she could end up on the other side of the country. The thought depressed her more than she cared to admit. Her stomach rumbled for what had to be the 100th time, and Heather sighed. It was time to get up. She reached down and grabbed her robe and pulled it into bed to warm it up. Janie burst into the room. You're still in bed? Breakfast is about to be cleaned up. I'm getting there. Heather sat up and quickly shoved her hands into the sleeves of her robe. Is it still crowded downstairs? I think what you really want to know is if your guy is still here. And the answer is yes, but I don't think he's staying much longer. Janie dropped onto her bed. Why'd you come in so late last night? Heather grimaced. She'd hoped Janie was sleeping. We were playing cards. You're not going to ditch this guy like all the others, are you? I like him. I don't ditch guys. Janie held up her hand. Let's see, there was Derek Mitchell, that one crazy guy you brought home last semester. His name was David and he wasn't crazy. Heather laughed at the expression on Janie's face. Okay, so he was a little crazy. How was I supposed to know he spouted Shakespeare at random moments? You were dating him. You should have known. Janie climbed off her bed and threw Heather's clothes on the floor as she went through her luggage. Wear this. Heather held up the floral blouse. I don't even know how this got in there. I put it in there. It brings out your eyes. Janie held a finger up in front of Heather's nose. Don't let him go, or I'm going to be ticked. He's the first guy you've actually smiled for. And besides, if he can survive playing a card game with you, he's a keeper. I'm not that competitive, Heather mumbled, but she knew that wasn't true. Besides, why do you care? Because I don't want my sister being a cat lady. Janie grabbed her room key from off the dresser. Are you coming? Heather pointed at her hair. You think I want to go down looking like this? Oh, right. You fix that. I'll go get your breakfast ordered. Janie slammed the door before Heather had a chance to answer. For being 12, Janie sure acted like she was 20-5. It was true that Heather had a bad record with guys, but she didn't need her little sister to remind her every moment she got. But again, Heather had her residency coming up and couldn't afford to get into a relationship right then. She pulled her hair up into a messy bun and made sure she had her key and her phone before leaving the room. People milled about the lobby, some helping take down Christmas decorations, while others chatted with friends or family. This hotel was insanely busy for being out in the middle of nowhere. The large windows were caked with snow from the blowing wind. It was a perfect time to stay inside. Heather walked into the dining room and searched for Janie. Her parents waved from a table near the front. She weaved her way through and sat down to a breakfast of oatmeal and fresh fruit. Janie knew her well. Morning. She drizzled honey over the oatmeal. What are your plans for the day? We were just trying to decide that. We'd hoped to go see the ranch, but it looks like the roads are going to be pretty bad. Mom sighed. We came to visit family, but we may just be hanging out here for the next few days. That's not so bad. Heather took a bite of her oatmeal. It was cooked to perfection and still hot. Dad raised his eyebrows. I thought you wanted to get out of here. Janie shot her a sly look. Mom, can I go play games? Stay with your brothers. Thanks. She took off, leaving Heather with her parents. Dad leaned forward. Janie tells me you have a boyfriend. When did this happen? Depends on which boyfriend she's talking about. The guy who sat with us yesterday. Dad studied Heather. Was she right? Heather shrugged. I don't know. He's a nice guy, and we've spent a lot of time together, but I've known him for what, 3 days? Mom laughed. You realize that's how long your dad and I knew each other before he asked me to be his girlfriend, right? Really? Heather looked between them. How'd I never hear that? We've told you that story, right? Heather shook her head. I would have remembered that. I thought you two dated for a couple of years, before finally getting married. We did. But I knew as soon as I met her that I wanted her to be my wife. It just took a while to get her to agree. Mom elbowed Dad. If I remember right, you had to finish your degree first. That was part of it. Dad chuckled. We were at a dance and I saw her across the room. It took a bit to get up my nerve, but I finally asked her. I took her out the next 2 nights, and then asked her to go steady. Heather glanced up to see Stuart talking to a few friends on the other side of the room. Her heartbeat raced when he laughed at something someone had said. It took a second to realize her parents were watching her with smiles on their faces. He's a nice guy. I just can't let anything get in my way of getting this residency. I've worked too hard for it. Sweetie, if you keep waiting for your residency or graduation or anything else, the right time will never come. We're not telling you to marry the guy. We just want to see you happy, and Janie's right. This is the happiest we've seen you in months. If not years. Mom reached over and patted Heather's hand. Good luck. I think we'll go see what their library has to offer. Heather waved at her parents, then stared down at her oatmeal. She couldn't believe her parents were trying to match her with some guy she'd just met. Can I sit here? Or are you too into your oatmeal? Stuart stood next to her table, smiling down at her. It's not talking back. She waited for him to sit. No work today? I'd hoped to head home, but the drifts are too high. The joys of Idaho weather. He leaned back in his chair. If the wind dies down, I might be able to get home tonight, but I'm not holding my breath. It's a whiteout right now. Heather glanced over at the windows. These weren't as caked with snow, but she couldn't see much through the fog. I wouldn't want to go out there right now. Good idea. Is your new house going to be okay in this? Heather pushed her bowl away and rested her arms on the table. Stuart shrugged. I hope so, but I won't know until I go back. There aren't any trees like there are here, so it's getting the brunt of the wind. Yikes. Yeah, but it should be fine. I hope. Stuart pulled out his phone. I got a few pictures the other day. Heather took the phone from him and flipped through them. I love it. This is the kitchen? Stuart leaned in, and Heather caught the smell of his aftershave. Yeah, I'm putting an island here, and another counter here with 2 ovens. Wow. Plan to feed an army in that kitchen? Heather had to focus on her breathing as his fingers brushed against hers. No, but it does have to feed my ranch hands. Whenever I hire some. He scrolled through. There's my land. See that tree there in the distance? That one? Breathe, Heather. She pointed at a large cottonwood tree. Yep, that's the end of the property. He flipped to another picture. And then I'm up against the mountain on this side. Heather's jaw dropped. She couldn't imagine owning that much land. Seriously? What are you going to do with it? Raise animals, grow crops, a little of everything. He took his phone back. How'd you get that much land? Heather caught herself. Sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. Stuart chuckled. It's okay. I actually inherited some of it from my great-grandpa. He bought up a lot of the land in the area, but never did much with it. He sold most of it over the years, but my dad convinced him to keep this plot. He'd wanted to use it himself, but Mom wanted to stay in town. That's cool. I think the most my dad ever inherited was my grandma's car. Heather laughed. It was this old VW bus, and it was painted in rainbow colors. My dad drove it for years, and I was mortified every time he took me to school in it. Does he still have it? Nope. He sold it when he got the huge contract. Figured he should probably drive a respectable car. Strangely enough, I actually miss the thing. Stuart smiled. Crazy how that happens. Yes, it is. Heather twisted a strand of hair around her finger until she realized what she was doing. So what does your dad do? Stuart cleared his throat and looked down at the table. Hey, Stuart. A guy walked up and glanced over at Heather before handing Stuart a paper. Your dad says to check your phone. He's been trying to call. The freezer is defrosting somehow, and you're about to lose everything inside. Stuart cursed under his breath and jumped up. Sorry, gotta go. Heather stared after him in shock. So he was a grocer? That would be horrible to lose everything. She hesitated before jumping up to run after him. Maybe she could help. Then she could stay at her aunt's house if the weather was too bad to get back out here. Hey, Stuart, wait. Stuart paused and turned, worry etched in his face. Yeah? Wait. Let me come with you. I can help. He shook his head. You won't want to help. Of course I will. Just let me grab my coat. Heather took the steps 2 at a time and grabbed her coat from her room. She could tell her mom and dad where she went later. She had to catch up to Stuart. Stuart stood in the lobby, his expression guarded. Ready? Yep, let's go. Heather gasped as the door opened and the cold air hit them. You want to drive in this? I don't have much of a choice. He climbed into his truck and Heather climbed in on her side. This could get bumpy. Heather grabbed onto the armrest on the door. The roads aren't clear yet. Stuart didn't say anything as he gunned the motor and plowed through a snowdrift. I'll just have to clear it myself then. So, why didn't you do this before? Heather cringed as they went over another drift. She really needed to just keep her mouth shut. Dad said he had everything under control. I shouldn't have listened. His face was set in a scowl as he concentrated on the road ahead. Heather kept quiet and held on tight as they burst through snowdrift after snowdrift. Maybe she should have just stayed at the hotel. Oh, right. She let go of the armrest and pulled out her phone to send a quick text. Maybe jumping in the car wasn't the most brilliant idea, but she couldn't just sit there if something was wrong with the store. Things are going to be okay, right? I mean, it's snowing, so you have a freezer of sorts right there. Stuart shook his head. Not this time. Dad wouldn't have called if it wasn't bad. He turned the corner and they slid for a moment before continuing on. Too bad she hadn't had this truck after sledding last night. She wouldn't have gotten stuck. But then she wouldn't have had the chance to hang out with him the rest of the day. Of course, right now he wasn't exactly the greatest company. The town finally came into view and Heather could have kissed the ground. The roads were almost worse here. Fewer drifts, but the ice had them sliding, even with his four-wheel drive. Stuart pulled up to the curb and turned off the truck. He sat there for a moment, clenching his jaw. Please don't hate me. Why? Heather cut off as Stuart jumped out of the truck and ran into the building. She climbed out and pulled her coat tighter to her. The icy winds bit into her cheeks and nose, and she ran inside the store. And stopped in shock. This wasn't a grocery store. It was a butcher shop. Filled with guys shouting to each other while they moved huge slats of meat from one freezer to the other. No wonder he'd avoided talking about what he did. The first time they'd met, he'd made fun of her diet. When she asked what his dad did, the subject was immediately changed. He'd been afraid to tell her what he did for a living, for fear of losing her. Heather shook her head and smiled as she pulled off her coat and grabbed a pair of gloves and an apron. The larger slabs were too heavy to carry, but she could take the cut-up pieces. The smell in the freezer was terrible. She had to step back out and take a deep breath before walking back into it. It was too frenzied to talk to anyone or find out what needed to be done, so she just grabbed what she could and followed everyone else. The meat had names written on the sides, so she tried to keep them together the best she could with the ever-shrinking space in the freezer. She went back for a second armful, snagging a mask on the way. It made breathing in easier, but still didn't completely take away the smell. At least this way she wouldn't pass out from lack of oxygen. On her way out of the broken freezer, she ran into Stuart. His eyes widened as he looked down at the meat in her arms. I thought you'd left. Heather shook her head and kept moving. She wasn't about to let go of the breath she was holding. After the last load had been moved, she sat down on a bench as far away from freezer as possible. The smell was still there, but it wasn't quite as bad. Stuart walked over and sat next to her. Want me to take you to your aunt's house? This could take a while. What happened with it? The electricity went out with the winds last night. Only thing Dad can figure is that there was a power surge when it came on. Knocked out the compressor. Heather flinched. The same thing had happened to their fridge when they'd gone on vacation one year. It hadn't been great to come home to a week later. Ouch. Are you sure you don't need any more help? Yeah, there's not much we can do until we get the part. Thankfully we'd just emptied out several orders, or it could have been worse. Stuart rested his head against the wall. Okay. My aunt's house is fine. I don't want to brave those roads again anytime soon. Stuart laughed. Neither do I. I'll let my dad know where we're going. He went to the back while Heather put her coat back on and threw away her gloves, apron, and mask. A large man came out with Heather and wiped his hands. His smile was almost identical to Stuart's. So you're the one I've been hearing about. It's nice to meet you. He held out a hand. Thanks for all of your help. You're welcome. It's nice to meet you too. She shook his hand and winced at the strength in his grip. Stuart put an arm around her and guided her toward the door. Heather's stomach did flip-flops as they walked toward the car. She immediately missed his touch when he let go to open the door. The drive to her aunt's house was short, but still adventurous. If anything, the roads had gotten worse in the hour or two they'd been inside the butcher shop. Stuart pulled up in front and stopped. He cleared his throat. So, you don't hate me? Why would I hate you? Because I'm the local butcher. He played with a loose thread on the seat between them. Heather laughed and shook her head. Stuart, it's a job. It's not like I hate all meat eaters. I actually loved a good hamburger up until a couple of years ago. But I had a few roommates who were vegetarians, and I got used to their food. After a while, I decided I felt better eating what they did and stopped eating meat. So, going in there didn't gross you out or anything? He asked, surprised. You realize I'm going to be a surgeon, right? I've seen worse. His puppy dog eyes were too cute. She leaned over to kiss him on the cheek, but this time, Stuart turned his head at the last moment and their lips met. Heather jumped back in surprise, then leaned in to kiss him again. When she finally pulled away, he seemed just as dazed as she felt. Her heart thudded in her chest as she fumbled to find the door latch. Thank you for the ride. See you around? I sure hope so. He hesitated. What if you didn't go in there right now? Can we go to lunch or something instead? Heather looked over her shoulder at her aunt's house. If she knew her Aunt Cassie, she'd be staring out the window at them, but she didn't care. You don't have to get back to the shop? He shook his head. We're closed for now, and the part won't be here for a couple of days. Okay. She climbed back in, mentally apologizing to her aunt for ditching her yet again. Where are we going to eat? You'll see. Stuart smiled and pulled away from the curb. Chapter 6. Stuart couldn't believe he'd kissed her. But when she'd closed in, he couldn't just let her kiss his cheek again. Not after how she'd reacted to the secret he'd been keeping. He glanced over at her as she watched the buildings go by. Man, she was beautiful. And a surgeon? He was way over his head here. He pulled into the diner parking lot and had to pump the brakes so his truck wouldn't slide into the building. Welcome to our local diner. Wow. I didn't know this place was here. How many times have you actually visited? Stuart asked. She shrugged. I don't know. I came several times when I was younger, but then life got too crazy. Stuart climbed out of the truck and helped her out. He put an arm around her so she wouldn't slip as they walked into the diner. A blast of warmth hit them when Stuart opened the door. Hey, Jamie. The waitress brightened when she saw him. Hey, Stuart. Slow day? We had to close. One of the freezers died during the night. She gasped. Oh, man. Was anything ruined? We're not sure yet, but it looks like my dad caught it in time. He glanced around the diner. Looks like it's slow here, though. I expected it to be packed for lunch. It's the storm. Not too many crazy enough to go out in it. She grinned. So, 2 for lunch? Stuart nodded. This is Heather. She's Mrs. Peterson's niece. It's nice to meet you. Jamie gestured toward a booth. How is this? Perfect. Thanks, Jamie. Stuart slid into one side of the booth and Heather sat on the other side. Heather shook her head with a half smile. You know everyone, don't you? Pretty much. Happens when you're the only butcher in town. Stuart smiled up at Jamie when she brought hot chocolate for both of them. Thank you. No problem. She walked away to help another customer. Wow, free hot chocolate? Heather took a sip of it. Oh, man. That's amazing. Stuart nodded. It's her mom's special recipe. They give it to their customers when it's snowing or super cold outside. Keeps people coming back. Well, it worked for me. Heather scanned the menu. So what's good? Their pancakes and eggs are really good. Wait, you can eat eggs, right? Heather nodded. I couldn't give those up. Or dairy. I'll even eat the occasional fish if I'm in the mood. So you wouldn't say no to ice fishing? Stuart figured Patrick wouldn't care if he invited her along. It wouldn't be the first time one of them had brought a date along, depends on when you're going. We leave on New Year's Day. Stuart's stomach dropped. That was only a few days away. They'd just started getting to know each other. I'll have to ask Patrick. Maybe on New Year's Eve? He just said next week when he mentioned it. It sounds like fun if I'm still around. Heather sipped at her hot chocolate. What can I get you too? Jamie asked. Heather handed her the menu. I'll have some pancakes, eggs, and toast. Oh, and a side salad. Perfect. And the usual for you, Stuart? Yep. Sounds great. Jamie wrote down his order and walked away. Stuart folded his arms on the table. So how much school do you have left? This is the last semester. Wow. Heather smiled. Wow is right. It feels like I've been in school forever. And then you become a world-famous surgeon? I wish. Heather sighed. No, I still have to go through residency. I'm so nervous. I have my interviews starting in a couple of weeks, and I have to decide where I want to go. And then I have to pray they'll want me. They'd be crazy not to pick you. Stuart put his hand on hers. Heather raised an eyebrow. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I've studied like crazy, and I'm the top of my class, but that doesn't mean I'll be good under pressure. True. Stuart caressed her hand with his thumb. So, what schools are you looking into? Let's see. I applied to hospitals in Seattle for my parents' sake, Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta. Plus, a children's hospital in Salt Lake and another one back east. Salt Lake wasn't too far, but the other locations seemed like a universe away. That's cool. When do you find out again? March. Heather picked up her phone. It's my parents. 1 second. She stood and left to take the call, leaving Stuart alone in the booth. He should just take her back to the hotel and let her out of his life right now, because if they spent any more time together, he was going to fall head over heels for her. He could still feel her slender fingers in his, and that kiss, he ached for another one. Sorry about that. Mom just wanted me to grab a few things that were left at Aunt Cassie's. Think we could run by there on the way back to the hotel? Heather paused. That is, if you're okay taking me back there. Sure. The snow has stopped, and it looks like the wind might be dying down for now. We'll see if we can grab my uncle's plow for the front of my truck, just in case. Heather raised her eyebrow. Your uncle has a snow plow just sitting around? The county isn't great about getting our roads cleared, so we just take it into our own hands. Most of the time we can get away with not plowing, but we'll want it on the way back. The food arrived just then. Stuart got the same bacon burger he always had along with fries and a milkshake. You really want to eat that around her, Stuart? Lance, one of Stuart's friends, stood next to the table along with a few other guys. Hey, Lance. What are you doing out in the snow? I thought your mom banned you from going out without a coat. Stuart glanced over at Heather and caught her glare at Lance. The other two, Carl and Thomas, snickered. Stuart sighed and scooted over. So much for a quiet meal. Lance and Carl sat next to Stuart and Thomas slid in next to Heather. Don't mind Lance. He doesn't know how to act around women, which is why he doesn't have a girlfriend. I'm Thomas. He held a hand out, but Heather just glared and went back to her pancakes. Thomas shrugged and stole one of Stuart's fries. Hey, so we're looking at going fishing tomorrow if we can make it up to the reservoir. What happened to the pond out by Rachel's? Stuart swatted Lance's hand away from his plate. It's not frozen enough. Carl tried to walk out on it and we had to pull him out. Thomas turned to Heather. Are you coming? Or is that against your vegetarianness? Heather snickered. Vegetarianness? Nice word. And yes, I'm coming. That is if your group can handle having me there. Sure you can handle it? I mean, we use bait and stuff. Stuart put a hand up. Hey, guys? Lay off her. Besides, Heather is going to be a surgeon. I think she can handle worms on a hook. Whoa. Seriously? Thomas leaned in. Have you had to cut anyone open? I've worked on cadavers, yes. Heather held up her fork. Think I can eat my food now? Thomas stood. Right. See you two tomorrow. The guys found a booth across the diner from Stuart and Heather. Sorry about them. They're good guys for the most part. They just don't think before they speak. Stuart thought back to the night at the hotel when he'd made a snide comment about Heather's diet. I guess I'm not much better. At least you didn't ask if I'd cut anyone open while we were trying to eat. Heather took a drink of her hot chocolate. So where is the reservoir? Stuart gestured to the south of them. I'll show you when we leave. I'm not sure I want to head up there, though. If the roads are bad here, I don't even want to know what they're like on the winding roads. Winding roads and ice don't sound like a good mix to me. Heather finished the last bite of her pancake and pushed the plate away. We can go check out the pond and see if it's okay if you want. No hills, and we're headed that way anyway. Heather nodded. Let's do that. Stuart pulled out his credit card and picked up the receipt. We'd better head out then. Especially if we need to run by your aunt's house first. Sounds good. Heather grabbed her coat and followed him to the front of the diner. I can pay for mine. I was the one who insisted on going out to eat. Stuart handed the card to Jamie. Besides, my mom would never forgive me if I let you pay for yourself. Heather grinned. I don't think my mom would either. But I wanted to offer anyway. Then I win points from both moms. Works for me. Stuart took her hand as they walked out the door. Careful. It's probably still slick. He helped her in, then walked around to his side. Thomas and the others caught his eye as he climbed in. They were making faces and pointing at Heather, then shrugging. Stuart shook his head and climbed into the truck, hoping she hadn't seen anything. Your friends are classy people. Heather frowned at the window of the diner. Stuart groaned inwardly. She'd seen. They're pretty good guys for the most part. But put them in front of a beautiful woman and they turn into cavemen. Heather laughed. I guess that's one way to put it. I guess it wouldn't surprise you that they're all single? Stuart pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward Mrs. Peterson's house. Not at all. Heather stared down at her phone and suddenly brightened. Good news? Heather let out a whoop. Yes. Sorry. I've been waiting for days for my grades to post. Straight A's. Well, not quite. I got an A-, but close enough. Congrats. That's amazing. Stuart reached over and squeezed Heather's hand. It's beyond amazing. I was really stressed about a few of them, but I guess I knew the information better than I'd thought. Heather leaned her head against the headrest and let out a sigh. I can't believe it. So, I guess this means you get to relax for the rest of your vacation then. Not that he'd given her much time to do anything else. Heather shook her head. I wish. This just reminds me of how much work I need to do to get ready for my last semester. Stuart tried to push the disappointment away. Of course she would need to study. Do you want to just go back to the hotel and not worry about the pond? What? No. I want to see the pond. But then I should head back and start studying. Between the interviews and classes, I'll have a full plate once school starts up again next week. You sure? Yes. I'm sure. Heather set her phone down on the truck seat when they pulled up to Mrs. Peterson's house. I'll be right back. Stuart nodded and took out his own phone. Hey, Dad. How are things looking? So far, the other freezer is holding up, so we're good. I pushed back a shipment for another day or two, so we have time to get the part in. Did you order the stuff to do electric and heating yet? Yeah, it's supposed to get here tomorrow. If the truck can get through. Guess we'll work on the house if we can't work at the butcher. Sure you don't want to hang out with Heather? She's a great girl, you know. Stuart sighed. Yes, she is. But she's leaving in a few days. Besides, she has to study for school, so I think today and going fishing tomorrow will be it. There was a pause. That's too bad. I like her. Oh, I have a call on the other line. Let me know if you get the parts, and I'll be out there to help you. Thanks, Dad. Stuart hung up and checked his email to see if there was any news on his shipment. He'd worried that they would be late with the weather, but it looked like they were out for delivery that morning. That meant he could work on it in between fishing the next day. Heather came out a few minutes later with a bag and a plate of cookies. Aunt Cassie wanted you to have a treat for giving me a ride. Sweet. Her cookies are the best. Stuart took a cookie off the plate and bit into it. Perfection. It was still hot, so the chocolate was melted. She knows exactly what I like. That's what she said. Heather set the bag on the floor of the cab and took a cookie for herself. Did you find out about the plow thing from your uncle? Stuart shook his head. Totally forgot. Want to run by, or should we chance it? Let's just go. We made it here, right? Heather put on her seatbelt. Stuart glanced up at the sky. The sun poked out between the clouds, but it was still pretty overcast. He wouldn't go to his uncle's, but he did need to grab a few things. He wasn't about to sleep on the floor again. A few minutes later, he pulled up in front of his parents' house. I'll be right back. Unless you want to come in and meet my mom. I'm good. I need to call my advisor back really quick. Stuart picked his way across the sidewalk and up the steps to his house. He found his mom standing at the sink washing dishes. Hey, Mom. Grabbing stuff, and then I'm taking Heather back to the hotel. Mom dried her hands and turned to face Stuart. Okay, sweetie. Oh, I have Rachel's pie plates. I'll send those with you. Sounds good. Stuart went up to his room and grabbed a bag for his clothes and other items he'd need, then went down to the basement to find his sleeping bag and mat. His mom stood at the kitchen door with pie plates in her hand. Thanks. I'll be back later tomorrow. The supplies are coming in today, so I'll be working on my house and then go fishing with Thomas and a few other guys. And Heather? Probably. He opened the door. Love you. Oh, and can you let Dad know I'll be working out there tomorrow? Love you too, sweetie. I'll let him know. Thanks. Stuart went out to the truck, shoved his things in the back seat, and climbed in. Okay, now I'm ready to go. The roads were still pretty slick on the way, so he had to go slower than he would have liked. New drifts had taken the place of some of the older drifts in places. Other spots still had his tracks where he'd broken through. So how far is your house from the hotel? Heather asked. About 10 minutes when it's good weather. Stuart grimaced as they came up against a larger drift. The back tire slid a little as he gunned the engine. He shoved the truck into reverse, then went forward again. This time they were able to break through. Well, that was fun. Heather gripped the seat. Let's not have that happen again, okay? I'd prefer not to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere as well. Stuart swerved around another drift. Maybe we should have grabbed the plow. I guess so. Heather laughed as they went over another bump. I have to say, though, that this is way more fun. Stuart glanced over at her and smiled. She could be so serious when talking about school and her job, but then her humor and playfulness would come out. He just wished there was a way to get her to stick around. New Year's Day was coming too fast. It was a relief when they finally saw the hotel up ahead. The roads cleared up a little in the area, which meant that Rachel's dad must have been out with his tractor. Several cars were still parked there, but it had cleared out a little since that morning. Looks like people wanted to beat the next storm. Stuart climbed out and grabbed his things. So, you're still staying here tonight? Was that hope in Heather's voice? He nodded. I figure this way I can get to my house quicker and get started on the electrical. You know, if you'd like help, my dad is probably bored out of his mind. He could help out. Heather nodded toward him. He's reading a magazine right now, which means he's going even crazier than I thought. Stuart wanted to say he was fine, but the truth was, the more help he could get, the better. Sure, that would be great. Heather walked over to her parents. Hey, we're back. Aunt Cassie says hi and wants to know if we're going to make it to the New Year's party. That's the plan. Her mom stood and took the bag from Heather. Thanks for grabbing these things. It amazes me what the boys can forget sometimes. No kidding. Heather turned to her dad. Hey, want something fun to do tomorrow? Stuart's working on his house and could use some help. The magazine was dropped immediately, and her dad leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. Oh? How can I help? However you can, really. With this storm, I need to make sure nothing was damaged, and then I'll be doing all of the HVAC stuff so we can get the heat on and get to work on the drywall. Sounds good. What time are you heading over? Stuart thought for a moment. Probably after breakfast, so around 8. That'll give my dad time to get here. Sounds great. Her dad picked up the magazine and opened it. Stuart raised his eyebrows at Heather, who shrugged. Apparently, the conversation was over. He went over to the desk where Rachel sat at the computer. Hey, Rachel. Did anything open up for tonight? Oh, hey. I thought you were back home. I headed in this morning because of a broken freezer, but I had to bring Heather back out here. And since I'm going to work on the house tomorrow, I figure it's easier to just stay. Rachel typed a few things into the computer, then nodded. We have one more room. I can give you a discount, no discount. I'll pay what everyone else is paying. Stuart pulled out his credit card. Besides, I already stayed here for free last night. Yeah, on our floor. Rachel took his card. I still feel bad about that, by the way. Stuart laughed. Don't. It's the first time I've slept in for years, and adding all the extra blankets from the closet definitely helped make it more comfortable. I'm glad. She handed him a key. You'll be at the end of the hall, to the left. Dinner is at 6. Thanks. He turned to find Heather still talking to her dad, so he grabbed his stuff and took it up to the room. He'd only been in the main parts of the hotel since it had been finished. The room he'd be staying in was small, but the decor gave a nod to the time period when this mansion had been built. He'd have to check everything later, but for now, he wanted to get back down to find Heather. She sat curled up on a chair in the lobby, studying a rather thick book. Her homework. Maybe he should just let her get that done. Going to the pond could always wait. He turned to leave. Oh, hey, there you are. I was beginning to think you'd decided to take a nap. Heather shut her book, keeping a finger in it as a bookmark. Did you still want to check out the pond? Stuart nodded toward the book in her arms. Are you sure you don't want to study? Want to? No. Should? Probably, but it's hard to get into when my sister loves to burst into the room at random times. And studying down here is almost impossible. If you're sure. Stuart stopped. Give me a sec. I need to grab my thicker coat. He walked over to Rachel's desk, checking to make sure Heather had gone back to studying. Hey, do you still do rentals for skates and stuff? We have a few things. What are you looking for? Thomas and a few others said the pond wasn't frozen enough to go ice fishing on, but I want to check it out myself tonight. Then I remembered you were offering rentals on skates for a while. Rachel raised her eyebrows. Not frozen enough? My dad had to go save a horse that had gone out into the middle of it yesterday. It's definitely frozen. The wind has been too cold for anyone to want to go outside, so we have a room full of skates. You're welcome to go find some. Thanks. Stuart opened the room behind the main desk and searched the rows of ice skates. He found his size, then grabbed a few that looked to be around Heather's size. She was still busy studying when Stuart left the room, so he handed Rachel the keys and crept through the kitchen, waving at the staff as he went by. "Hey, guys. Don't mind me." He ran the skates out to his truck, then went back in through the kitchen. His shoes were snowy, so he had to stop and clean them. "Oh, hey, Stuart. Did I need to sign for a delivery?" Patrick stood nearby holding a clipboard. No. Sorry. I'm just trying to surprise Heather and had to use a back exit." He stood up straight. "Wait. I didn't miss a delivery that was supposed to come out here, did I?" Patrick chuckled. "I wondered the same thing. From what I could tell on this sheet, you weren't supposed to bring anything until next week." "Well, I guess we're good then." "Oh, and if Heather asks, I was never in here. I never saw you." Patrick went back to his clipboard, and Stuart moved around the chefs who were preparing dinner for the night. Heather looked up when Stuart approached. "Ready?" "Wait, isn't that the same coat you were just wearing?" He looked down. "Yeah. I realized I left the jacket in my truck." "Ready to go?" Heather slammed her book shut and stood to stretch. "Let's go." The pond wasn't too far from the hotel, but it took longer with the snow covering the roads. They pulled up and parked in the small parking lot next to it. Stuart wanted to pull out the skates right then, but he figured he'd check the ice first. If a horse really had gotten onto the pond, it could have weakened the integrity, and he didn't want to go plunging into freezing cold water. He walked out onto it and stamped his foot. "Seems solid enough. What do you think?" Heather hesitated. "You're sure it's fine? Come on. You'll see that it's okay. We can go out about 20 feet and fish there." He held out a hand for her to take. She finally took it and walked toward him. "Seems solid enough to me. So what were your friends talking about?" Stuart shrugged. "Like I said, they love adventure too much, and driving up an icy road with a drop-off on one side is right up their alley. They can do that if they want. I prefer this one." She glanced around. "This is a perfect place to come and hang out. Look, there's even benches over there. Yep, this is perfect for fishing, swimming, or whatever. In fact, hold on." He led her over to one of the benches. "I'll be right back." He went back to the truck and grabbed the skates from the back seat of his truck. He stopped at the edge of the pond and put his on, then skated over to Heather with the other pairs. "I wasn't sure which pair was your size." Heather grinned and jumped up. "You didn't?" "I haven't skated in so long." "Well, today is your lucky day. Sit down and I'll put it on for you." He pulled off her boot and tried the first skate. "How is that?" Heather stood and stamped her foot. "Feels good." "How'd you know what size?" "I'm psychic. And I peeked inside your shoe before I picked one." "Ah." While she tied that skate, he helped her put on the other one. "It's been forever, so you'll have to bear with me for a bit." Stuart took both of her hands and pulled her up. "That's what I'm here for. We'll take it slow." Chapter 7. As they took the first few steps, it was more Stuart gliding and Heather being pulled behind. Heather couldn't help giggling as she tried to keep up with him. "Sorry, I'll get it. I was actually pretty good when I was younger." She squeezed his hand as she lost her balance. "Sorry." Stuart laughed. "You don't have to keep apologizing. It's not quite like riding a bike. Close. But not as slick. You're truly inspiring. You know that, right?" Heather took a step and somehow stayed upright. A few more steps, and things clicked. She let go of Stuart's hand and tried a few glides by herself. "I did it. Keep going. I'll catch up." Stuart's voice was farther behind than what Heather expected. She twisted around to see where he'd gone and almost lost her balance. Stuart had stopped and had his phone out, recording her. "You didn't catch that last part, right?" "Of course not." Stuart. Delete it. He laughed and shook his head. Keep going. Let's see if you can do a spin. You do it first. Okay. He tucked his phone in his pocket, then glided past her, speeding up as he went. When he had enough momentum, he spun. Like that. Heather blinked. I can barely stay upright, and you want me to go all figure skater? You said you used to be good, right? Could you do the spins then? Well, yeah. But that's when I went ice skating every week with my family. Heather could almost feel the thrill from the first time she managed to do a sit spin. It had taken months to master. Stuart skated over to her. Okay, we'll wait a bit then. Heather took his hand and they skated around the small pond before stopping next to the bench where her boots sat. Stuart sat down to rest, but she was finally getting the hang of it. She didn't know when she'd be able to do this again, and the sun was beginning to set. She wanted to take advantage of the fact that she was here now. The air froze her cheeks and burned her lungs as she made another trip around. She angled her skates just right and spun in a wide circle, then used her toe pick to shoot her off the ground into a flip. She landed and spun one more time before realizing what she'd just done. Maybe it was more like riding a bike than what Stuart thought. She turned to find Stuart standing there with his jaw dropped. The phone in his hand seemed forgotten as he stared over it. I remembered how to spin, she called. I see that. Heather skated back, her legs burning with exertion. It would be a miracle if she managed to get out of the bed in the morning. She started back toward him and didn't see the drift until too late. Whatever grace she'd had in that flip was completely gone as she landed hard on the ice. Heather! Stuart's voice rang out, followed by the sound of his skates coming closer. Are you okay? Hey, did you hit your head? Heather grabbed a handful of snow next to her and rolled over, hitting him in the face. His look of concern quickly turned to surprise and shock. Heather gasped for air as she laughed. The wind had been knocked out of her, but getting him with snow had been too tempting. Stuart grabbed a handful of snow and threw it at her, hitting her neck. Here I am, making sure you're okay, and you repay me by throwing snow? I'm sorry. But, your face, Heather forced out. She rolled over, trying to stand. Her feet kept slipping out from underneath her, making it even more comical. Stuart held out a hand to lift her, but she was laughing too hard. He finally lay down next to her. You're a little crazy. You know that, right? You just noticed? Heather took deep breaths, trying to get her breath under control. The adrenaline that had come from doing the flip and then falling shortly after had begun to fade, leaving a dull ache in her knee and ankle. She'd be fine, but getting back to the bench was going to be fun. So, when you said you were pretty good when you were younger. I won a few competitions. But then I got older and the medical field became more fascinating to me. Stuart rolled over and propped himself up. Do you regret it? Nope. I still love what I'm doing. I just wish I'd stayed in better shape. I'm going to feel this tomorrow. Probably. He pushed up to his knees. The sun is about to set, which means the wind should be picking up any minute. We should head back. Heather rolled over, but getting up wasn't an option. Stuart slid his arms around her waist and pulled her up that way. She turned to face him, conscious of how close they were standing. She reached up to brush the snow off his hat and out of his hair. Her breath caught when he pushed hair away from her face and ran a thumb along her cheek. Stuart leaned down and brushed her lips with his. They were cold, but a wave of warmth ran through her as she wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. Time seemed to pause while they stood there in the cold air. All the worries of school and where she'd end up faded away. She just wanted this moment to last forever. A wolf howled in the distance, shattering the silence. Stuart broke away, caressing her cheek again. His arm slid down her back, sending shivers through her as he took her hand. They stopped at the bench to change out of their skates. Heather's mind was a swirl of emotions as she fumbled with the icy laces on the skates. Now that they were done skating, she realized just how cold she was. Her fingers could barely move, but she finally got the skates off. Standing on solid ground in her boots felt strange as she walked back to the truck. Stuart took the skates from her and put them in the back of the truck. Heather leaned her head against the headrest and closed her eyes. Are you sure you're okay? You went down pretty hard. Stuart started the truck. I'm fine. Just exhausted. My head didn't hit the ice, but I'm going to have a few bruises tomorrow. Stuart pulled out and headed back to the hotel. His hand found hers and squeezed. Did you have fun? More than I've had in a long time. Thank you. Heather smiled weakly, then closed her eyes again. It took too much effort to keep them open. I'm fine. Really? Heather pushed away from her mom and went to the stairs to take her coat up to her room. Except the stairs were 3 times longer than she remembered. Maybe she'd take it up later, but sweetie, you look pale. Her mom put her hands on Heather's cheeks and looked into her eyes. Your pupils seem fine. Heather sighed. Mom. I didn't hit my head. I already told you that. I know the symptoms for a concussion. And doctors are more likely to be the ones who insist they're fine, but they're not. Mom led her over to a couch. You rest here. I'll see if they will bring your dinner out to you. Heather glanced over at Stuart, pleading with her eyes. It's okay. I'll help her into the dining room. Why don't you go save us a table? Stuart wrapped an arm around Heather's waist, holding her tightly to him. If she wasn't weak in the knees before, she was now. Even after ice skating for a couple of hours, he smelled good. Heather shook her head. Maybe she wasn't okay. Hey, Stuart? Maybe I need to stay on the couch for now. He led her over and sat down, pulling her legs up onto his lap, making it easier for her to lean her head on his shoulder. Where's your phone? We should text your mom. It's in my pocket. Heather pulled it out and sat up long enough to send a text, then laid her head on his shoulder. The lights had been turned down low when Heather opened her eyes again. She must have fallen asleep after they sat on the couch. Stuart was asleep next to her, but otherwise the lobby was empty. Her dinner sat on the coffee table in front of her. She carefully leaned forward and picked up the bowl of salad and a fork. The croutons had given up being crunchy hours before. It was probably better that way. She didn't want to wake up Stuart. No, not better. Soggy croutons weren't her favorite. But she choked them down. After sleeping off the grogginess, she was starving. When the salad was finished, she pulled out her phone and found her notes. It was finally quiet, and she had a lot of studying to do. She'd gone through several pages of anatomy notes when her phone buzzed with a new email. Another hospital wanted her to interview with them. In Tennessee. She tried to feel excited. This was one she'd hoped for. But all she could think of was how far away it was from Idaho. Did she really want to leave this behind? True, this could be just a Christmas holiday fling. But that's not how it felt. Suddenly this guy snoring next to her on the couch had become someone she didn't want to be without. Heather stared at him for a moment, before closing out her notes. She pulled out the list of hospitals she could choose from. There were a few close by. She bit her lip, and before she could talk herself out of it, she applied for them. If it was meant to be, it would happen, right? Stuart stirred next to her and sat up. He rubbed his neck and looked over at Heather. What time is it? It's past midnight, I think. You should go get some sleep. Heather curled her legs up so he could move. You should too. Heather shook her head. I just slept for a while. I'm going to study until I'm tired. Need some help? I'm good. You go to sleep. Stuart stood. I would argue, but I'm beat. See you in the morning. He leaned down to kiss her lightly, then stumbled up the steps. Heather sighed and went back to her notes. She could deal with her feelings later. Right now, she needed to study the correct steps for simple surgical procedures. Chapter 8. Stuart made sure he had everything he'd packed and zipped up his bag. He needed to get over to the house to accept the delivery and get the generators turned on so he could get some heat going inside. He grabbed the key and went downstairs to check out. The breakfast crowd was just starting to trickle into the dining room. He'd find a table as soon as he checked out and took the bag out to his truck. "Hey, Patrick." Stuart set the key on the counter. Patrick looked up from his computer. "Oh, hey. Rachel told me you stayed last night. How'd you sleep?" "Amazingly well. I got to sleep in 2 days in a row. Getting back to my early hours just might kill me. I must say, that's one reason I'm glad Rachel went into this business instead of insisting I go into the ranching business. Long hours, but at least I can sleep in on the days I don't have to watch the front desk." Stuart laughed and picked up his things. "I'll be back in for breakfast. If you see Heather, have her save me a spot." "Will do." The weather had warmed up a little since the day before, but the wind was still cold. Stuart hoped the heaters his dad had rented would be enough to keep them warm while they worked. The sooner he could get the heating done, the better. None of Heather's family had come down to breakfast yet, so Stuart went for the continental breakfast instead. He grabbed some fruit, a couple of bagels, and some sausage and sat down. "Now, that's what I call a balanced breakfast." Heather laughed and sat down next to him. "Dad already ate and he's gathering whatever tools he can find in the car so he can be ready. I think you made his day inviting him to help." Stuart chuckled. "Hey, I'll take any help I can get." Heather popped a grape into her mouth and waved her mom and sister over to sit with them. "I may stay behind. I have a lot of studying to do and not a lot of time left to do it." "Want me to help?" "I mean, I don't know any medical terms, but if you have cards or something, I could run through them with you." She poked at the eggs on her plate. "I have a huge pile of flashcards, but I don't want to get in the way of getting your house done. And I'm not sure. Let me help. You can keep me company while I pull wire, and I can throw out terms for you. Not that I'll know if you're right or wrong." Heather laughed. "Are you sure?" Stuart took her hand. "Of course. You leave in a few days, and I want to spend as much of that time together as we can. I mean, unless you'd rather not." "That depends." Heather stared down at their hands clasped together. "On?" She met his eyes, sadness reflected in them. "On what we want to have happen after this week." Hey, sweetie." "Hey, Stuart. Neil is ready to go whenever you are." Heather's mom sat down with her plate. Stuart swallowed his disappointment. He'd hoped to know how Heather felt, but it had been interrupted. He forced himself to smile. "I'm almost done. Thanks for letting me borrow your husband for the day." Heather's mom laughed. "Are you kidding? I was planning to head to Cassie's house today, and I can guarantee he'd rather build something than listen to me gossip with my sister. You're doing both of us a favor." "You're going into town?" Heather asked, surprised. "The road seemed to have cleared a bit, and I promised Janie and the boys that they could play with their cousins again before we have to leave. Did you want to come with me?" Heather glanced over at Stuart before shaking her head. "I'm going over to the house, too, if that's okay. Stuart is going to help me study." Stuart could feel his face redden and avoided the searching look that Heather's mom gave him. They were here to spend time with Mrs. Peterson's family, and he kept taking Heather away from them. Her mom nodded. "Okay, then. I'll see you tonight at dinner. Oh, and unless you have other plans, Cassie wants us to be there for New Year's Eve. She even found some treats that you can eat." "I'll be there." Heather took a drink of her orange juice. Stuart wiped his face on a napkin and stood. "We'd better head out so we don't keep your dad waiting." "Oh, right." Heather stood and pushed in her chair. "See ya, Mom." "Oh, and Janie, I put your gloves on the heater last night. They were still wet." "Thanks." Janie didn't look up from the game she was playing. Stuart stopped when he got to the lobby. "All my stuff is in the truck, so we can go as soon as you have your stuff." "Okay, I'll be right back." Heather ran upstairs and came back a moment later carrying her backpack. All right. Let's go. Heather and her dad followed Stuart out to the truck and they piled in. Stuart pulled out of the driveway and drove the 3 miles to where his house stood. Some of the plastic had blown off, but otherwise, it looked untouched. He just hoped the wood wasn't damaged beneath. Stuart grabbed the toolbox from the back of his truck and walked over to turn on the generator. My dad should be here with some space heaters soon. We should have everything delivered pretty soon. I'll take you on a tour until they all get here. Heather stared up at the house, and Stuart would have given anything to know what she thought about it. They walked inside, and Stuart took them through the house. He'd shown the house to several different people several times, but for some reason he was much more nervous this time. He wanted it to be perfect in their eyes. You have a beautiful house here, Stuart. Heather's dad ran his hand along one of the doorways. Everything is strong and well built. Thank you. Stuart breathed a sigh of relief. His phone buzzed. Oh, Dad's here. We can heat up the house now. Dad came inside with a space heater. Where do you want this? Let's put it in that corner and another one over in that corner. He grabbed an extension cord and went out to hook it up to the generator. By the time they had the other heaters hooked up, the supplies had been delivered. Stuart took the breaker box into the utility room and set it into the wall, then took a pile of wire. The others took a pile as well and moved on to different parts of the house. He looked over at Heather, who sat next to one of the heaters. Okay, where do we start? You said you had flashcards, right? Yep. It has a situation, and I have to figure out the best treatment. Heather held out some cards. Just read the front to me, and then turn it over to see if I'm right. Stuart took the cards and glanced through a couple of them. So, like, someone comes walking with their arm hanging at the wrong angle. What do you do? Heather blinked. Yeah. I'd say there's a good chance that you broke your arm. Stuart laughed. Hey, you got it right. You came up with that awfully fast. Personal experience? Yep. 9th grade baseball game. I slid into home and the catcher landed on my arm. End of baseball season for me. Stuart sat the cards on one of the studs of the wall where he was threading wires. Ouch. Heather stood and walked over to hold the wire while he worked. Okay, next one. Stuart had to force himself to concentrate on the flashcards in front of him instead of the woman standing next to him. Instead of the way she smelled like lilacs. Or how his arm brushed against her while he pulled the cord through the hole in the stud, profuse sweating, numbness on the left side, patient is having a hard time breathing. He met her eyes and swallowed. Man, she was beautiful. He leaned in, brushing her lips with his. She kissed him back, both of them ignoring the flashcards that fell to the ground when he dropped the wires he'd been holding. Voices came from the front of the house, jerking Stuart back to reality. What was he doing? They'd never get done with the house if he kept getting distracted. He pulled away from her and cleared his throat, pretty sure that's not how that was supposed to go. Heather smiled and reached up to kiss him again. Yes, but it was much more enjoyable. Oh, hey, there you are. Thomas's voice made Stuart jump. We thought you might want some help. Heather bent down to pick up her cards, and Stuart picked up the wires he'd let drop to the ground. We? Stuart stapled the wires to the stud. Yeah, the guys are all here. Your dad told me you were upstairs, but he didn't tell me I'd walk in on that. Hey, Heather. Thomas, right? Heather's face was bright red as she shook his hand, then walked over to sit next to the heater. It was probably better for both of them that she stayed right there. Thomas leaned against the door. I hadn't realized you had so much done. This is awesome. Thanks. If you want to help, start in the next bedroom. Where's everyone else? Stuart glanced over his shoulder at Heather. She was back to studying her notes. Carl is downstairs helping your dad and some other guy with the heating. Lance is grabbing food from Burley. He should be here soon. Thomas picked up a drill and a spool of cord. Stuart gestured to Heather. The other guy is Heather's dad. He offered to help. Thomas glanced between them. Her dad is helping here too? Wow, really getting the family in on it, aren't you? Shut it. He builds houses for a living. Stuart drilled a hole in the next few studs, then went back to threading the wires. So, heard anything from Mandy lately? Thomas jerked upright. Why? Is she in town? Stuart laughed. No. But it was awesome to see your reaction. Have you even called her? We text sometimes. We're just friends. Heather snorted. That's what every girl wants to hear. She has a point, you know. Stuart grinned at the glare that Thomas shot at him. Fine. I'll change the subject. What happened to the fishing trip? Are we still going? That's the plan. You think Carl or Lance would be here helping otherwise? Thomas stripped the wire he was working on so he could attach an outlet. I bring you a burger and that's how you thank me? Lance stood at the top of the stairs with a hand to his chest. I'm hurt. Thomas smirked. You can't argue with what I said, though. Now, where's my burger? Lance held up 2 bags and came into the room. He threw one to Stuart and one to Thomas. Oh, Heather. Sorry. I didn't know you were there. If I'd known, I would have brought a salad. Or whatever you eat that's fast food. I'm good. Heather didn't look up from her notes, no, but seriously, though. What do you eat if you're going out for lunch? Heather sighed. There are plenty of things out there that aren't meat. Stuart balled his wrapper up and threw it at Lance. Leave her alone. We don't make fun of your diet choices. That's because pizza for breakfast is an accepted option. Heather raised her eyebrow. Accepted option for what? Clogging your arteries? Lance opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. I stand by what I said. Stuart picked up his drill and went back to work, hoping the noise would drown out any further conversation. Heather shot him a grateful look and went back to studying. So, Heather, out. Thomas and Stuart said, pointing at the door Lance sighed and picked up his bag. Fine. I'll go downstairs with the other guys. Where I'm wanted. Thomas turned to Stuart. You going to tell him that's Heather's dad down there? He'll figure it out soon enough. Dad stood next to Stuart, his hands on his hips. Looks good. You should be able to order the drywall for next week. Finally. Stuart pulled the drill bit out and set it in its case. Can you let Mom know I'll be home later tonight? I'm going fishing with the boys, but I want to be there to help get the freezer put back together. Sounds good. You guys be careful. I heard you were going to go up to the reservoir. I suggest you don't. Stuart turned off the generator. Correction. The guys wanted to go to the reservoir. I plan to go to the pond. Heather and I were there yesterday, and it was frozen enough that we can fish there. I like that idea much better. See you at home. Dad left, and Stuart turned back to the house. Stuart and his friends had gotten all of the wire done while Dad and Heather's dad worked on the heating. There were a few more vents he needed to install, but he could have electricity by New Year's Eve. Heather came downstairs pulling on her coat. Looks like everything is put away upstairs. Thanks again for your help with studying. No problem. Not that I did much. Thomas was way more excited to help than I thought he would be. Stuart wrapped his arms around Heather, pulling her close. It just felt right having her standing next to him here in the house. He should go into the medical field. He knew more than some of the kids in my class. Heather leaned her head against Stuart's chest. Stuart breathed in her smell. He'd have to plant lilacs in his yard, just so he wouldn't forget it. The thought brought a sadness that he wasn't expecting. He pulled away and grabbed his bag. He couldn't look at her as he shut the front door and walked to the truck. Hey. Heather grabbed his arm. Is everything okay? Yeah. It's fine. I just. I just wish Christmas break was a little longer. He opened the truck door for her. Knowing you're leaving in a few days, Heather nodded and climbed in. Stuart started the truck and pulled away from his house. The trip back to the hotel seemed to drag. Do you think we're crazy? Heather asked, catching him by surprise. What do you mean? Heather shrugged. I don't know. I mean, we met just before Christmas and 4 days later we can't, well, I can't imagine not hanging out together after this. We haven't really left each other's side since Christmas Day. Don't you think that's weird? Yes. But I think it's even stranger that the thought of not spending time with you is not something I want to do. Which means that it's going to be torture when you leave. Stuart pulled into the hotel parking lot. I know. I think, she paused. I think I'm going to stay home from fishing. Stuart's eyebrows shot up. That's not what he was expecting. Look, if this is about my friends, it's not. I just really need to study. I keep putting it off. And I know if I spend any more time with you, I'm not going to be able to leave when my parents do. I've put too much into my schooling to stop now. Stuart reached out and took her hand. You know I wouldn't want you to do that, right? She leaned over and caressed his cheek, then leaned in for a kiss. Stuart could feel the hunger behind it, and he ached with his own. When she pulled away, he was sure she had a tear running down her cheek. See you later, Stuart. Thank you. It took every ounce of strength he had not to run after her. But she was right. She had her career that she needed to worry about, and he couldn't get in the way. And even as he pulled away with a hollow feeling in his heart, he knew that it was for the best that they said goodbye right now. Chapter 9. Heather stared at the flashcards in front of her, knowing she should be studying. But all she could see was the way Stuart's eyes danced when he laughed. That day at his house had been perfect. Well, besides the heckling from his friends, but even that had made her feel more at home here. She'd been part of the group. Right now, she was supposed to be freezing on the pond catching fish she didn't really feel like eating. But instead she was sitting in bed, staring at piles of notes she had to go over. A knock on the door brought her out of her misery. She paused as she reached for the knob. It wouldn't be him, right? Another knock. She sighed and opened it to find Dad standing there. Oh, hey. Did I miss dinner? No, it's not for another hour. I'm running into town to have dinner with Mom. Want to come? Heather nodded. She grabbed her notes and shoved them into her backpack, then grabbed a toothbrush. This place had too many memories of him. Staying at Aunt Cassie's would help her clear her mind and study. Right? Dad didn't say anything as he glanced at the bag. And he was kind enough not to say anything until they were in the car on the way to town. Did you two fight? No. Do I need to have a talk with him? Heather rolled her eyes. I'm not 10, Dad. You don't need to fight my battles. Besides, we both decided it was better not to let things keep going. I don't know where my residency will be, and I can't do this. Dad patted her hand. I think you already did. I know. Heather sighed and leaned her head against the window. She suddenly sat up straight. Wait. How do you have the car? Your mom dropped it off on the way to Twin Falls. She and your Aunt Cassie decided to go shopping. Oh. Heather was clearly losing her mind. Dad turned music on to fill the silence in the car. Oldies drowned out the screaming thoughts in her head, and Dad's bass voice helped soothe her raw emotions. Just like they had ever since her first fight with her best friend in grade school. Did you ever think maybe you should look for residency programs closer to the area? Dad asked. I already did. And already applied. Because I'm insane. Heather sighed. I know you and Mom met and hit it off and everything was awesome, but that doesn't work for everyone. Dad hummed to the song on the radio, which meant he had an opinion but didn't want to push it on her. It was the way he and Mom had survived for so long. Heather growled under her breath. If you have something to say, then say it. What? Me? No, I was just enjoying some moody blues. He winked at her and turned a corner. You know what you want. What your heart wants. I'm not going to argue with either one of them. But I also know that if we always let reason rule over us, we'll never jump. And if we never jump, we'll never fly. Great, Dad was a philosopher now. Heather shook her head. It's not that easy. Of course it is. You just have to decide whether or not you want to listen to your wise, old dad. He winked and pulled onto Aunt Cassie's road. She climbed out of the car and walked inside. Her cousins sat on the couches and floor watching a movie while Cassie and Mom stood in the kitchen. Heather waved and went to the guest room. Mom came in a few minutes later. Hey, I thought you were fishing. Nope. I'm studying instead. Figured this would be quieter than the hotel. Heather pulled her notes out and cringed at their wrinkled shape. Maybe she should have been more careful when she packed. I don't suppose you want to go to dinner with us? Cassie told us about this diner. I'm good. But she wasn't. Of all the places they could have gone, which admittedly weren't many, and they had to choose the diner she'd gone to with Stuart. You go have fun. I'll watch the kids. Mom frowned. What's going on? Dad can tell you. I can't. Just go, and I'll see you when you get back. Heather blinked back tears while she separated her notes into sections. Okay, sweetie. But then I want to know everything. Mom left, followed by the other adults. Heather just hoped the kids would stay quiet so she could study for a while. Her phone buzzed, letting her know she had new emails, but she ignored it. She wasn't going to deal with anything else right now. It hurt too much. Janie raised a snowball and aimed, then pitched it. Eric smacked it with his bat, spraying snow everywhere. Eric took off running for first base before anyone could hit him with a snowball. It was a mix of baseball and a snowball fight so that Aunt Cassie would let them hit each other with snowballs. Heather sighed and slammed her anatomy book. It was New Year's Eve. The last day of their vacation. She stood and changed into some warm clothes and a jacket. The game was too tempting to pass up. Janie cheered when she saw Heather. Hey, you finally left your room. It's a New Year's miracle. Funny. Can I play? Sam handed her the bat. You know how to play? Yeah, I've been watching from my window. She stepped up to the makeshift home plate and swung a few times to stretch. Janie pitched the ball, and Heather swung, smacking the snowball. She shrieked as the spray of snow hit her. You have to run. Janie grabbed a handful of snow. Heather sprinted to first base, laughing as no less than 10 snowballs pelted her back. She was out. I think you went overboard. Not according to the rules. You pitch. Janie jogged over to home base and picked up the bat. Heather gathered up snow to make a snowball and waited for Janie to get ready. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sam running for third base. She turned and chucked the snowball at him, getting him in the center of his back. That's not fair, he yelled as he stood up. It totally is. Heather picked up another snowball. Don't steal the base. He glared and jogged back to take a turn at bat. Janie gripped her bat and got ready. Heather wound up and pitched the ball. It went wide. Oh boy. She was way out of practice. This time the ball went straight down the line, and Janie hit it. She dropped the bat and took off running. She made it to first base and then on to second before she was pelted by several snowballs. Heather raised an eyebrow. Innings don't last very long in this game, do they? Nope. Janie walked past her, wiping the snow off her sleeves. That's what makes it so fun. Heather kicked at the grass that stuck out from under the snow. I think you're running out of ammo. That's what I said. But no one wanted to go play at the park. Janie frowned. Why not? Heather asked Sam and Eric. It's too far. Heather sighed and pointed at the front yard. Let's go. I'll come too. Everyone cheered and ran for the sidewalk. Heather picked up the bat and followed behind them. The park was only 2 blocks away, in the center of the town. She'd only ever been there in the summer when they had their big celebrations, so it was like a whole different park covered in several inches of snow. Prints of dogs and other animals dotted the park, but otherwise it was untouched. See? Plenty of snow to play in. Heather shoved her hands in her pockets. Go. Janie, Sam, Eric, and the others let out a battle cry, and soon the smooth surface was broken by shrieking kids throwing snowballs. Heather sat on a swing, pumping her feet to go higher. The cool breeze felt good on her face as she moved back and forth. The blue sky welcomed her each time she went forward. Whenever she did settle down and get a house, she needed a swing in her yard. Maybe a tire swing if they had a tree in the yard. The sound of her ringtone pulled her out of her thoughts. Mom. Heather sighed and stopped the swing. Hello? Hey, sweetie. Where'd everyone go? We got back from Burley and everyone was gone. Heather grimaced. Sorry. I should have written a note. We went to the park after the kids ran out of snow in the backyard. Mom laughed. I figured they'd run out sooner or later. Cassie needs her kids home to finish with chores before the party. Okay. We're on our way. Heather hung up and whistled loud enough for her siblings to hear. Time to go. Mom and Cassie need us. There were groans, but they came. The promise of the party that night was apparently enough to get them to obey. Heather kept her head down as she walked so she wouldn't have to see the butcher's shop, but it still screamed at her, demanding attention. He had to be there. Without her, Heather suddenly stopped. That was strange. She took a few steps backward and breathed in deeply. The smell of gas permeated the air. She turned to Janie. Get everyone back to Cassie's. Now. What are you going to do? Heather grabbed Janie by the shoulders. Take a deep breath. What do you smell? Janie sniffed, then shrugged. Nothing. Dirt. Trees. Someone's barbecuing. Janie, look around. There's no one outside barbecuing. That's gas. You need to get them out of here. Now. Heather looked back to see Stuart and his friends laughing and heading for the butcher shop. Stuart. She called out. Stuart turned and froze. They hadn't talked in 3 days, so she could imagine the thoughts going through his head right then. He shook his head and walked inside the building. Fear spiked as she darted out into the road. A horn honked, and Heather had to jump out of the way of a pickup. She waved a sorry, but kept running. A low rumble shook the ground, throwing Heather backward into the road. Debris and smoke filled the air, darkening the blue sky. Heather scrambled out of the road so she wouldn't get hit. Sounds were muted after the sound of the explosion. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. People screaming. Debris falling. Smoke billowing out of what used to be the butcher shop. Heather grabbed her phone and called 911, then handed it to an older man who stood there staring. Talk to them for me. Tell them the building exploded from a possible gas leak and we don't know how many people have been injured yet. But, Heather pointed at the phone. Talk to them. The glass in the butcher shop was mostly gone, and the ceiling had collapsed in parts. Heather scanned the building, looking for any survivors. There had to be survivors. Hello? Over here. A low voice came from the direction of the freezer. She ran over and pried at the door, but there was too much rubble on the ground. I'll get you out. How many people are in there? Heather picked up bricks and drywall and tossed it behind her. There was a pause. There are 3 of us. You need to find the others. We'll be okay for a while longer. Are you sure? Heather paused. She recognized Stuart's dad's voice. Yes. We were getting the freezer turned back on when the explosion happened. Heather kicked more debris out of the way. Is there air in there? We're fine. Any idea what happened? I need to know if I need to evacuate. It was the generator. Go help them. We'll be fine. Heather nodded even though he couldn't see her and went back outside now that she knew there was no chance of another explosion. I need help. Come on. Several people came running while others stood there, unsure of what to do. Not that she could blame them. If there was one explosion, there could be more. You need to find any survivors. Pull out anyone you find and lay them here in the center. I'll be right back. Heather ran back out and pointed at two of the spectators. You two go to the department store and figure out if anyone was hurt there. Then you two go to the other side. Go. Heather ran back inside. A few people had been moved. She dropped to her knees and assessed their injuries. One man coughed and rolled over, groaning, "Hey, don't move. I need to make sure you're okay." Heather pulled out her keys and used the small flashlight to check his eyes. "Oh, hey, Thomas. I didn't recognize you. Where's Stuart and everyone else?" He coughed. "Some are in the freezer. Hopefully they're still fine. Stuart was with me in the back. He might still be back there. Thanks. The ambulance should be here soon." He coughed again. "I'm fine. Just sore. Go help the others." "Okay. Stay here. Keep an eye on these people, and I'll be back." Thomas nodded and rolled over to sit up. When Heather was sure he was okay, she picked her way over to the back of the shop. "Stuart?" She took a step and jumped back. She'd stepped on something soft. A person. Whoever it was didn't move. "Come and help." One of the other guys helping came over, grabbed one end of a large part of the ceiling, and moved it. Heather set it down and knelt next to the body. She cradled his head and carefully rolled him over. "Lance." She checked his pulse and sighed in relief when she felt it. There were no other injuries that she could see, but she didn't want to move him in case he'd done something to his spine. He could wait for the ambulance. Another sweep of the room confirmed her fears. Stuart wasn't in here. Panic began to bubble up, beating against the calm she'd been able to keep so far. He couldn't have just disappeared. And if he'd been right next to the explosion, well, she didn't want to think about that. Thomas limped into the back room. "Stuart's in here. He's in bad shape, but he'll be okay." "Are you sure?" Heather forced herself to breathe. In, out. "Stay calm, yes. They just brought him in. He'd been blown out, through the back." Thomas shook his head. "I can't believe he's even alive." Heather's breath caught as she looked at the hole in the brick. "He went out there?" "Yeah. Crazy, right? Have you seen, whoa. Is that Lance?" She nodded. "He's been knocked out and I don't want to move him until we have a backboard to put him on in case he hurt his spine." They passed by each other as she went to check on Stuart. Thomas had been right. Stuart was in bad shape. Blood had clotted on his scalp, and his leg was definitely not supposed to bend that way. Heather took her scarf and wrapped the wound on his head to keep it clean. The abrasions could wait for now, but she needed to do something to support his leg. She scanned the room to find something she could use, but it was all covered in debris. Her eyes fell on the freezer. It was still closed. She jumped up and moved things out of the way so she could open it. Stuart's dad, Carl, and two others sat in the corner. "Are all of you okay in here?" "We're fine." The freezer door kept out the blast. His dad pointed up at the ceiling. "And the roof wasn't covered so we had ventilation." "I'm glad. Everyone out here wasn't quite so lucky." "I need something to brace Stuart's leg." "Do you have anything like that?" His dad grabbed onto a freezer shelf. "Stuart's injured? I didn't even know he was here. He showed up seconds before the explosion." Heather backed out of the freezer and went back to Stuart. He was pale, but he was awake. "Hey, we're going to do something for your leg, but it's going to hurt." He laughed weakly. "I'm pretty sure it can't hurt more than it already does." "I wouldn't be too sure." Heather took his leg on both sides of the brake. She hadn't done this on an actual person yet. But it needed to be done. Ready? We're going to count to 3. Wait, what are you doing? Heather just smiled. 1, 2, she jerked the bone back into place. The crunch was immediately followed by screams from Stuart. Heather took the boards from Stuart's dad and set them on each side of the leg, then used saran wrap to keep it set. Do you hurt anywhere else? Heather asked. My head is pounding, and I can't move my shoulder, but nothing hurts worse than my leg. He gasped. Do you know what happened? She shook her head. I smelled gas coming from around here. That's why I tried to get your attention. This is what I get for not listening. He laughed again. Oh, ow. Yeah, there's another pain. My ribs don't like me either. You went through a wall. You're lucky you're alive. Heather stood. I'm going to go check on Lance. Sirens filled the air, and Heather wanted to cry in relief. She ran out to meet them. Hey, we have one guy who had the ceiling fall on him. Get to him first. Then there's another guy who has a broken leg, displaced shoulder, and possibly some broken ribs. Oh, and he has a laceration on his head. One of the paramedics looked at her strangely. Are you a doctor? Med student, but I was the first one on the scene. Heather bit her lip. Now that she had a chance to stop and think, she ran through all of the scenarios in her mind. She'd done everything correctly as far as she knew. But what if she made a big mistake? Lance probably shouldn't have been moved. She shook her head and went back inside. Her muscles screamed at her as the adrenaline wore off. She was almost as filthy as those who had been in the building when it exploded. Stuart was being loaded onto one stretcher, and Lance was strapped down to a backboard. Thomas stood talking to another paramedic and nodded toward Heather when he saw her. Heather McLean? A sheriff stood at the doorway. Yeah? Heather rubbed her forehead, trying to force the headache away. She was exhausted and needed sleep. I'm Sheriff Wood. From what I've gathered, you were the one in charge here? The man was a good 6 inches taller than her, but his eyes were kind as he shook her hand. Yes, I smelled gas and ran to try to get people to leave, but it all happened so fast. The man nodded. We're not sure what happened yet, but it's a good thing you were here to help until we could get here. You did well in there. Thank you, sir. Heather stopped when Stuart was wheeled past her. Excuse me. I need to go talk to him. Of course. We may have questions later, but I just wanted to tell you what a good job you did. She shook his hand again and jogged out to the ambulance where Stuart was being loaded in. Is he going to be okay? I'll be fine, Heather. Thank you for your help. He coughed and grimaced in pain. If you see my mom, tell her to meet us at the hospital. And with that, the doors were closed. The world spun as the exhaustion finally caught up with her. She dropped to the ground and kept her head down to try to stop the nausea. Miss, are you okay? Heather tried to wave them away, but a paramedic checked her eyes. I'm fine. I just need a drink of water and some sleep. Heather? Where are you? Oh, there you are, sweetie. Someone, Mom, wrapped her arms around Heather. Is she okay? Can I take her home? Yes, ma'am, but we need her information in case we have any questions for later. Heather stood and stumbled over to the car. She climbed in and leaned her seat back as far as she could. After what felt like an eternity, her mom finally came back to the car and closed the door. When Janie got home and told me that you said something about gas, and then ran for the butcher shop, I didn't have a clue what she was talking about. Then she mentioned Stuart ignoring you, and I'd hoped that you'd gone in to talk to him. We heard the explosion but couldn't figure out what it was until Cassie got a call from one of her friends. She wiped her eyes. If anything had happened to you, well, it didn't. I was lucky, though. I was almost to the building when it happened. Heather covered her eyes so the sun wouldn't shine into them. I could sleep for a few years, though. Mom reached over and took Heather's hand. We'll make sure that happens. Thanks. Heather stumbled out of the car when they got to Aunt Cassie's. She made it to her bed and collapsed. Someone helped take off her shoes and socks, then pulled off her coat. Whispers were heard in the background, but she ignored them. And finally silence. She was alone. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to let go. Sobs shook her as she pictured the whole thing over and over again. And then darkness as she succumbed to her exhaustion. Chapter 10. Stuart pushed the button to help him sit up. He was bored out of his mind sitting in the hospital, but he wouldn't be going home anytime soon. They'd done surgery on his leg, and he was supposed to have another one on his shoulder soon. The calendar on the wall told him it was January 2nd, but that couldn't be right. Heather hadn't come to see him. His friends were in different rooms here, so they got together as often as the nurses would let them. Which wasn't often because they were too loud for the other patients. He tried not to let the bitterness sink in. She'd saved his life, saved his leg, and helped his friends as well. The butcher shop was a total loss. They'd have to rebuild it. But since he was stuck here in his room, he wouldn't be helping out with that. Hey, Stuart. Mom stood in the doorway with a bouquet of flowers. These are from the McLeans. Aren't they beautiful? She set them on the table, then sat in the chair next to him. Dr. Wilson says you should be able to go home soon. Seriously? Stuart's mood lightened a little. I thought I'd be stuck here for longer. I haven't been able to put any weight on my leg at all. Mom fiddled with the zipper on her purse. Well, by soon, I mean in 2 days. But that's not so bad, right? I should be home helping Dad clean up the shop. He has plenty of help right now. Your job right now is to get better. Mom pulled out a catalog. I thought you might want to pick out colors for your walls and cupboards. Stuart raised his eyebrows. Why? Because it's better than sitting here feeling sorry for yourself, Mom snapped. You have so much to be thankful for, but you're sulking like a child. Mom had never talked to him like that. Ever. Even when he'd been a teenager, she'd always been nice. I'm sorry. Stuart faked a yawn. I think I need some sleep. You can stay if you'd like. I'll stay here. Your shoulder surgery is in a few hours, and I need to sign some paperwork. Mom stood and kissed his forehead. You're alive. Your friends and Dad are alive. Be grateful. Stuart nodded but didn't say anything. He didn't want to admit she was right. He picked up the catalog she'd brought him and flipped through it. Plans slowly came together in his mind and he reached for his phone to write down notes. He'd had the floor plan set in his head, but colors and what style of door he wanted were always far enough in the future that he hadn't thought about it. There were times while he wrote down options that he stopped to wonder what Heather would think of that option. By the time he was actually tired, he had the cupboards, faucets, and countertops picked out for his kitchen. The living room would be after he woke up. And for the first time in days, he went to sleep with a smile on his face. He finally had something to plan for, and he couldn't wait to get started. You can do this, son. Slow, easy breaths. Mom sat in a chair while Stuart had a physical therapist there to torture him. Easy for you to say. He grinned to let her know he was joking, but it quickly turned to a grimace. His leg therapy was going well, but his shoulder hadn't been healing as quickly as he'd wanted. Mom swatted him with the catalog in her hand. Have you decided on a color for the living room yet? I'm thinking yellow, but I haven't found the right shade yet. He groaned as he lifted the weight again. Can we take a break? The therapist nodded and picked up Stuart's cup. I'll go refill your water. How's the shop coming? Stuart grabbed a towel and dried his forehead. The town jumped in and it's coming faster than we'd ever expected. We should be able to open back up at the end of the month. Mom sighed. It's hit your dad harder than I thought it would though. He's blaming himself for what happened. Stuart laid back against the chair. This wasn't anyone's fault. It just happened. We can say that all day, but he doesn't listen. Stubborn man. Mom shook her head. Speaking of stubborn, your doctor told me that if you keep going like you have been, you can get released tomorrow. That's the best news I've heard for days. Stuart coughed, cringing at the dull ache in his ribs. Mom stood. I'd better get home. School will be out soon and I need to be home when the girls get there. Well, hopefully this will be the last time you have to leave without me. Stuart shifted in the chair. Any letters for me? Mom pulled a pink envelope from her purse. It came this morning. What's this? He took it from her and fingered the delicate writing. Heather. He'd been expecting bills, junk, anything but this. Mom kissed him on the forehead. I suggest you wait until you're back in your room alone. Love you, sweetie. Stuart waved, unable to speak. The therapist hadn't come back yet, and there was no way Stuart wanted to wait for him. He tucked the letter into the pocket in his t-shirt and forced himself to stand. The wheelchair was only about 10 feet away. He could do this. He took step by agonizing step before he was finally able to drop into the chair. Wheeling himself into his room was a whole different problem. Maybe he should have asked his mom to help before she left. His shoulder still didn't work well enough to use both arms, so he finally pushed one of the pedals to the side and used his good foot and good arm to get himself out into the hallway. Whoa, where do you think you're going? The therapist caught up to him and grabbed onto the bars. We don't want to pull out any stitches. I just decided I needed a nap. You weren't back yet. Stuart wiped his forehead with his good arm and relaxed while he was taken back to his room. Instead of waiting for help to get into bed, he stood and took the last couple of steps, ignoring the protests. Can you close the door behind you? Sure, I'll be back in a few hours to do our next session. The therapist set the water bottle on the table and left, shutting the privacy curtain and closing the door. Stuart pulled the letter out of his pocket and stared at it. He couldn't decide if he wanted to throw it or savor every word. She'd been gone for over a week now. No text, no email, no explanation. But she'd also saved his life. He opened the letter before he could talk himself out of it. Stuart, you probably think I'm the biggest jerk ever for just taking off, but I have to explain myself. After I left the shop that day, I went home and slept until the next morning. My mom says she asked if I wanted to stop by, but I don't remember that at all. Since then I've had several interviews and I'm neck deep in school. I thought I was doing pretty well going into my residency, but I'm learning that I know almost nothing. I wanted to thank you for a wonderful week. It was more than I could have ever asked for, and I didn't want to let it go. I shared more with you in those few days than I have with anyone for, well, years. I want to wish you luck, and I hope your recovery is going well. I'm not sure when I'll get off of work next, but I'd like to see you. If that's okay with you, thank you for everything. Heather. Stuart stared at the letter, emotions warring with each other. She'd taken the time to write, actually handwrite, a letter, but there was nothing about how she actually felt. He set the letter aside and closed his eyes. He could still see her face, her smile, and felt the touch of her lips on his. Was it only one-sided? He'd been so sure it wasn't. He'd write back later, when he knew what to say. Chapter 11. School was going to be the death of Heather. She was sure of it. Between trying to keep up with interviews and getting her homework done, she barely had time to breathe. Or think about Stuart. Guilt plagued her whenever she had a moment to breathe, so she kept going. Work, school, interview, and homework. That's all she allowed herself to do. It was mostly true that she slept through going to see Stuart on the way out of town. She was aware enough that she knew she couldn't face him. If she had, she would have decided to stay to take care of him. January had dragged on, and February was even worse. March was here now, and the only thing anyone talked about when they weren't studying was where they hoped to go for the residency. The match would be happening in just a few days. Heather's last class of the day had seemed to last an eternity by the time the bell rang. She slammed her book shut and shoved it in her bag, anxious to get home. There were tests in 3 different classes that she needed to study for that night. A light drizzle fell as she left the building. Perfect. The rain fit her mood, and rather than running to her car like everyone else did, she took in the peace that came with the storm. She was soaked through by the time she got back to her apartment, but she didn't care. It was nothing a hot shower couldn't handle. Once she was done with that, she wrapped up in pajamas and a thick robe. Her roommates were still out, which meant that she could have some silence while she studied. She threw some ramen into the microwave, then sorted through the mail. She froze. An envelope with her name on it from an address in Idaho. He'd written back. Heather picked up the letter, but she couldn't decide if she should open it or not. What if he'd totally rejected her apology? She wasn't sure she could handle it if he did. The letter had been a spur-of-the-moment thing when she missed him so much she couldn't breathe. The microwave beeped, making her jump. She dropped the envelope next to her books. Maybe after she studied for a while she could open it. It could be her reward or something. She took the ramen out and set it down at the table. The letter sat next to her, mocking her with every page she turned. Every vocabulary word she memorized. Finally, she grabbed the letter and ripped it open. Heather, it was great to hear from you. When you disappeared after the accident, I figured you were gone for good. I want to thank you for helping my family so quickly. I relived those last moments over and over again. When you tried to get my attention, how hurt I felt when I turned and walked inside like a jerk. And then that moment. It was deafening noise, just before I was blown backward. I'm sorry. I never should have pushed you away. I never should have ignored you. But I just couldn't get in the way of something you seem to love so much. The healing has gone slowly. I'm now home, but the healing is still taking longer than I'd like. I have to tell you that the doctors were impressed with how you were able to get the leg back into position. Best of luck with your schooling. You'll be an amazing surgeon. Stuart. Heather couldn't move. Her eyes scanned the page over and over. It was like hearing his voice coming out from the page. He never should have pushed her away? What was that supposed to mean? It had given her a spark of hope until he mentioned her schooling again. She folded the letter and slipped it into her notebook, then went back to her test notes. Writing back could wait. Just until she went to bed that night. Then she could fill him in with what had been going on. Sounds of laughter came from outside in the hallway, followed by loud music. Great. Someone had decided to have a party instead of studying for midterms. Heather grabbed her headphones and put them on, hoping to drown out the noise. Just a month and a half left, and she could be done with school and move out of these college dorms. The thought made her smile as she picked up her first flashcard. It was here. Heather held the match letter in her hand. She should have been at one of the parties on campus getting ready to rip it open, but instead she sat on her bed with a half-packed bag next to her. 3 times she'd gone out the door. 3 times she'd realized what she was doing and walked back in. Finding out where she was going just didn't seem the same doing it alone. Heather's phone buzzed with a notification that she needed to leave now to get to the airport. If she was going to go. No if. She stood, grabbed her bag and keys, and forced herself out the door. Each time she wanted to turn back, she made herself keep walking. Even as she drove, she kept the envelope clutched in her hand. The security line at the airport was long as usual. Heather nearly turned around and left several times before she reached the front. She handed over the ticket before she could change her mind again. It was torture, letting going of the letter so she could go through the metal detector. That was her future in that envelope. The flight was already boarding when she got to the right gate. It was better that way. She couldn't change her mind. She found her seat on the plane and sat down, forcing herself to relax. Just a few hours now, and she could be at Stuart's door. Ma'am, that letter needs to go in your luggage for takeoff. A stewardess smiled down at her. I'm just going to hold on to it. I wouldn't want anything to happen to it. Heather held tightly to it. The woman frowned, but then forced another smile. I'm sorry, but you really need to put it away. You can take it back out when we've taken off. Heather sighed and put the letter in her backpack. It would be fine. After all, it wasn't like the bag could go flying forward or backward because it was secure under the seat. Or, at least, she thought it was. Maybe it wasn't. She reached down to grab it, but the plane began to taxi down the runway. Fine. She could wait just a few minutes. The lady sitting next to Heather leaned over. That envelope must have something important in it for you to be so stressed. Yes, it's pretty important. Heather tried to pay attention to the last-minute flight instructions, but she was too distracted. So, why don't you open it? Heather sighed. Because I don't want to open it yet. Heather wanted to cry when the plane finally took off. 2 hours, and she could see Stuart again. If he'd even opened the door for her. Chapter 12. Stuart sat down on his new couch in his new house and set his bad leg up on the coffee table. The colors he'd chosen were just right if he did say so himself. He couldn't believe it had been a month since he'd finally moved in. The carpentry for the door frames and a few other minor details still weren't done, but it was a lot easier to work on them when he was already here. It would be a while before his yard was ready for animals or anything, but he was home. He kicked his boots off and sighed with relief. It had been a long day at the butcher shop, and he was ready to sit back and watch some basketball. The knock at the door made him freeze. Mom and Dad hadn't been planning to come as far as he knew, and his friends were off on dates or whatever. Stuart stood and went to answer the door. He was sure the peephole was wrong. There was no way Heather was standing on his doorstep. She was off at college. Right? He opened the door to find her standing there. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked exhausted, but right then she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Hi. Heather ran her fingers along an envelope. I hope you don't mind that I'm here. But I didn't. I didn't feel right opening this without you. Come in. Stuart stepped aside so she could walk past. How'd you know where to find me? Aunt Cassie told me. Heather still held tightly to the envelope. This is a beautiful house. Stuart felt a burst of pride. She liked it. Just as he'd hoped she would. Thank you. I spent a lot of time at physical therapy, so my mom sat with me and helped me choose colors and styles. Well, you did an amazing job. Heather hugged the letter to her. So, what brings you back here? Stuart didn't mean to sound rude, but she'd appeared out of nowhere after avoiding him. Heather held up the letter. It's my match day. And I couldn't open it with strangers on campus, and going home didn't feel right either. I needed you. I hope you don't mind. Stuart nodded. I'd like that. Can I get you a drink or something? No. Now that I'm here, I just want to open it if that's okay. Of course. He gestured to a chair. You can sit if you'd like. Heather sat and stared down at the letter. Even now I don't think I can open it. Here, you do it. Stuart reached out to take it, but then shook his head. You've waited too long for this. You do it. Okay. Heather slid her finger under the seal and opened it, then pulled out the letter. She read with one eye open while the other was squeezed shut. Her eyes ran back and forth on the page. And? Heather gasped, and then burst into tears. Stuart was filled with dread. Maybe she hadn't been matched. Or maybe it was somewhere she didn't want to go. He reached out and took her hand. The familiar zing of electricity was there, and he wanted to pull her into his arms. Is it bad? She shook her head and handed him the letter. He hesitated before taking it. The words blurred as he scanned through, but he stopped at the location. St. Luke's. He read through it again, hope rising in his chest. You'll be here in Idaho? She nodded. When things were going so well with us, I took a leap and threw a few local options onto my list of preferred schools. I wasn't sure how the interviews had gone and never really heard anything after that. Stuart reached forward and took both of her hands in his. You asked to come here? To be with me? I did. But if you want me to say no, her words were unspoken as Stuart pulled her in for a kiss. He'd missed her lips on his, the way she felt in his arms. And now that she was back, he didn't want her to ever leave again. She pulled away. Does this mean you're okay with what I did? When I saw the locations you'd chosen, I was sick to my stomach. Stuart shook his head. I can't believe you're going to be a resident so close to here. Heather snuggled into his arms. So you're not mad? Never. I thought maybe I could come and visit you when I have my days off. I mean, I might not have many of those, but I'd like to at least try. Stuart laced his fingers through hers and kissed her hand. We have a few months to figure that out, right? You have school to finish? Yeah, I'll come as soon as I graduate. Perfect. Stuart stood and went to the cupboard for wine glasses. It's time to celebrate. Heather took one of the glasses. To finding a hospital nearby. Stuart raised his glass. Finally, after living here for the last month, his house finally felt complete. To our future. Epilogue. 1 year later. Heather was sure she could sleep for a month. She'd gone several days with no sleep at the hospital, and it was finally her chance to get away. The trip to Stuart's ranch was a little farther than she wanted to drive, but she had to see his face. It had been too long. The framing of a barn sat near his house, and he already had a chicken pen and a few cows. Heather shook her head as she pulled in front. A lot had changed in a year, and she loved watching it come together. She found the key that would let her into the house and dropped her stuff inside the door. Hello? Maybe Stuart was still outside working on the barn. It would be just like him to forget to come in for dinner. She turned on the light and jumped back, surprise. Stuart stood with several friends, her Aunt Cassie, and a few she didn't know. A large sign hung across the ceiling that said, "Congrats on surviving for your first year." Heather covered her mouth with her hands. He'd done all this for her? Tears filled her eyes as she hugged each of the guests. Stuart came out with a large cake. And behind him, Mom? Dad? What are you doing here? Mom wrapped her in a hug. We couldn't just let you celebrate without us, could we? Thanks. I thought Dad had some business trip or something. This was the business trip. Stuart called and asked if he could get some help with the barn. Stuart stepped between them. Well, that was only slightly true. I do need some help on the barn, but I had something else as well. Heather's mom gasped and put her hand on her heart. Please tell me I know what this is. Stuart smiled and turned to Heather. He got down on one knee, and Heather thought her heart was going to beat out of her chest. This has been a long year for you, and I know that coming to see me has been rough on you. I'd like to make your time here more permanent. That is, if you'll agree to have me. Heather McLean, will you marry me? Cheers rose up all around them. All Heather could see was the pleading look on Stuart's face as he held out a beautiful princess diamond ring. Yes. Heather waited for him to slide the ring on her finger, then threw her arms around him. When they'd come for Christmas 2 years before, she wasn't expecting anything other than a vacation from school. And now here she was, about to become a butcher's wife, and she wouldn't have it any other way. This has been Rescuing His Heart by Jaclyn Hardy. I hope you have enjoyed the story. Make sure to check her other audiobooks. You can also check out her stories at www.jaclynweistbooks.com.